quiet now. At first, she interprets your silence the way she always has, through the old lens. In her mind, quiet has always meant pain. Withdrawal meant disappointment. Distance meant you were licking wounds, replaying conversations, waiting for a sign to re-engage. That version of you made sense to her. It followed a familiar emotional logic. When something mattered to you, you reached. When it hurt, you went quiet, but only temporarily. Silence, in that context, was a pause before the return. But this time, something doesn't line up. Your quiet doesn't feel fragile. It doesn't feel heavy or charged with emotion. It feels settled. There's no tension behind it, no urgency, no sense that you're bracing for impact or waiting for permission to speak again. And that's what throws her off. Because people who are hurting tend to leak emotion. Even in silence, there's residue, subtle signals of longing, restlessness, or unfinished business. Your silence carries none of that. Instead, it feels deliberate. You're not withholding words to provoke a reaction. You're not testing the waters. You're not trying to regain leverage. You're simply not reaching. And the absence of effort is what makes it so loud. She notices that you're no longer scanning for openings or cues. You're not watching to see if she's noticed your absence. You've stopped orienting yourself around her awareness entirely. That shift is deeply unsettling because it removes her from the center of the dynamic. When someone's emotional gravity no longer pulls you, the balance changes. Silence stops being a tactic and becomes a state. You're not holding your breath anymore. You're standing on your own ground. And when a man reaches that place, there's nothing for the other person to push against. No resistance, no neediness, no emotional hooks to grab onto. This is where the confusion begins for her. She can't explain why your quiet feels heavier than words ever did. She senses that it isn't coming from injury, but from clarity. And clarity is dangerous to the old dynamic, because it doesn't ask for resolution. It creates it internally. There's a Stoic idea that real strength shows itself through restraint, not reaction. Stillness, when chosen, isn't absence, it's containment. You haven't disappeared emotionally. You've consolidated. And that's why your silence feels different now. You're no longer waiting to be understood. You've already decided where you stand. Number 2. She misses the old you. What she misses isn't just you, it's the version of you that made emotional access feel effortless. The man who was present without conditions, available without hesitation, predictable in a way that felt safe, even comforting. You didn't just offer attention, you offered emotional continuity. She always knew where you stood. She knew your tone, your timing, your willingness to lean in, even when the situation was uncertain. That consistency became a quiet safety net, one she didn't realize she was standing on. And because it was always there, it faded into the background. The old you didn't require her to regulate herself emotionally. Your warmth absorbed tension. Your reassurance softened doubt. If she pulled away, you stayed steady. If she wavered, you remained open. Over time, that dynamic trained her nervous system to expect your presence as a stabilizer. Not consciously, but emotionally. You became the place where uncertainty could land without consequence. That's what she misses now. When that energy disappears, the ground feels different. Suddenly, there's no automatic warmth waiting to catch her when she feels unsure. No familiar rhythm of emotional availability she can step back into. And without realizing it, she's left facing her own fluctuations without your calm buffering the impact. What once felt like connection now reveals itself as dependency on your emotional consistency. The shift isn't loud. It doesn't arrive as loss at first. It arrives as exposure. You didn't become cold. You didn't withdraw affection out of resentment. You simply reclaimed energy you had been offering freely. energy that once flowed outward without requiring alignment in return. And when you stopped supplying that constant emotional presence, the dynamic rebalanced itself. For the first time, she has to carry her own emotional weight. That's uncomfortable. Not because you did something wrong, but because the old arrangement no longer exists. She can feel the difference in conversations, in pauses, in the absence of reassurance she didn't realize she relied on. The silence where warmth used to live creates a subtle anxiety, not fear of you, but fear of not being able to lean the way she once did. This is where many men misunderstand what's happening. They think she misses attention. But what she truly misses is access to your unguarded emotional energy, the version of you that gave without measuring the cost. When that disappears, it forces a recalibration. Stoic philosophy has long warned against generosity that drains the self. Balance matters, presence matters, giving matters, but not at the expense of inner stability. What you did wasn't punishment, it was correction. You didn't close off your heart. You simply stopped overextending it. And now, she feels the absence not because you're gone, but because the old version of you is. Number 3. Calm feels like rejection. In the past, emotional intensity was never a problem for her, because intensity meant involvement. Arguments, explanations, emotional reactions, even frustration, all carried the same underlying message. You were still engaged in the dynamic. When you raised your voice or tried to explain yourself, it confirmed that she still occupied an important space in your inner world. Conflict, in that sense, wasn't something to avoid. It was proof of connection, proof that the emotional cord between you was still intact. That is why your calm now feels so unfamiliar to her. You no longer argue your point or rush to correct misunderstandings. You don't feel the need to defend your intentions or convince her of how you feel. Instead of meeting emotional pressure with emotional force, you respond with composure, restraint, and measured silence. From the outside, that shift doesn't look like growth. At first, it looks like withdrawal. To someone who learned to associate passion with reaction, calm can feel like distance, even when it's simply the absence of chaos. What unsettles her is not that you've become cold, but that you've become unreachable through the old channels. Anger once gave her something to work with. Emotional explanations offered openings. Even disappointment created a bridge back into conversation. But calm provides no surface to grip. There is no emotional friction to pull you back into orbit. Your steadiness closes the loop without confrontation. And that finality is what makes it feel heavier than anger ever did. She may interpret your composure as rejection because it no longer feeds the emotional rhythm she was used to. There is no urgency in your tone, no emotional spike to signal unfinished business. And without those signals, the mind fills the gap with meaning. Silence becomes assumed indifference. Peace gets translated as emotional distance. Not because that is your intention, but because calm refuses to perform reassurance on demand. This is the quiet power of emotional discipline. When you stop allowing provocation to dictate your internal state, you remove yourself from cycles that once drained you. Stoic philosophy speaks clearly on this point. If someone succeeds in provoking you, it is because your mind allowed it. What you've done is reclaim that authority. You're no longer surrendering your balance in exchange for temporary connection. Your calm is not meant to punish or exclude. It exists to protect what you've rebuilt inside yourself. And when someone can no longer reach you through emotional pressure, it forces them to confront a truth they weren't prepared for, that your peace is no longer negotiable. And this is the moment worth sitting with for a second. Not to judge her reaction, and not to praise yourself, but to notice what has actually shifted inside you. Ask yourself where this calm came from, and what it cost you to build it. This is where growth becomes real, not performative. If this resonates, pause the video and reflect on how emotional discipline has changed the way you show up in relationships. And if you feel called to share, leave a comment with your thoughts, or simply type, "I protect my inner peace," below. Your reflection might be the clarity someone else needs right now. Number 4. She can't pull you in. There was a time when the dynamic followed a familiar rhythm, one that required very little effort on her part. She knew the entry points, a certain message at the right moment, a particular emotional tone, a hint of vulnerability or warmth, and you would reappear. Not because you were weak, but because you were open, emotionally responsive, willing to re-engage without questioning whether the invitation aligned with your own center. That predictability became part of the unspoken script between you. Over time, that script stopped feeling like connection and started functioning like access. She didn't need to demand your presence or chase it. She simply had to signal. A subtle shift in energy, a carefully timed message, or a familiar emotional cue was enough to pull you back into orbit. Your emotional availability was always within reach, and because it was reliable, it began to feel permanent, not consciously assumed, but emotionally expected. That's why the change unsettles her now. She reaches out the way she always has, expecting the same result. But this time, the signal doesn't land. The echo never comes back. There's no emotional rush to meet her halfway, no instinctive pull toward re-engagement. You're not resisting her attempts, and you're not hardening yourself against them either. You're simply no longer identifying with the need to respond. That difference is subtle, but profound. From her perspective, it feels like losing a familiar tool. The old methods don't fail dramatically. They just stop working. There's no confrontation, no rejection she can point to, no emotional reaction to interpret, and without feedback, uncertainty creeps in. She can't tell whether you've moved on, grown indifferent, or simply changed internally. All she knows is that the emotional lever she once pulled no longer moves anything. This creates a quiet discomfort because it removes her sense of influence. Not power over you, but familiarity with how the dynamic functions. When someone is no longer emotionally available on demand, the entire emotional economy shifts. Access becomes conditional, presence becomes intentional. And that shift forces awareness, where there once was comfort. What you've done isn't avoidance, it's alignment. Stoic philosophy speaks to this kind of transformation clearly. The disciplined man doesn't spend his energy fighting temptation or suppressing desire. He outgrows identification with it. You're not battling the urge to respond, you've simply stopped organizing your inner world around external signals. And that's why she can't pull you in anymore. Not because you've closed yourself off, but because you now choose when and where your emotional energy belongs. Number 5. She doesn't feel in control. There was a period when the emotional landscape between you felt stable to her, not because she was consciously trying to control you, but because your responses were familiar and reliable. You were consistent in your presence, generous with your attention, and steady in the way you showed up. That consistency created a sense of emotional predictability, and predictability often feels like control, even when no manipulation is taking place. She knew how you would respond in moments of closeness, tension, or uncertainty, and that knowledge gave her a quiet sense of orientation. What she relied on wasn't power over you, but the reassurance that your reactions would be there when she needed them. When she felt unsure, your warmth grounded her. When she pulled back, your steadiness remained. When emotions became unclear, your availability softened the edges. Over time, your presence became part of how she regulated herself emotionally. You were a constant reference point, a stable signal in a dynamic that otherwise felt fluid. And because that stability was always there, It stopped being recognized as something that required mutual care. That's why your distance feels so disruptive now. Your emotional withdrawal doesn't arrive with anger or accusation. It shows up as a lack of reaction, a calm absence where familiar responses used to be. And without those responses, she loses a source of emotional feedback she once depended on. She can no longer gauge herself through your tone, your reassurance, or your engagement. The mirror she unconsciously used to steady herself is no longer reflecting back. This creates uncertainty, not because you've done something cruel, but because the dynamic has changed without explanation or negotiation. From her perspective, the loss of predictability feels like a loss of control. She doesn't know how you'll respond, or if you will at all. And that unpredictability introduces vulnerability she isn't prepared for. She can no longer rely on your emotional availability to stabilize moments of doubt or indecision. What once felt secure now feels unsteady, not because you've disappeared, but because you've stepped out of the role you once played. Stoic philosophy reminds us that true freedom begins where emotional dependence ends. Courage isn't always loud or confrontational. Sometimes it's quiet, expressed through the refusal to remain available at the cost of one's inner balance. By choosing distance, you've chosen autonomy, and to someone who once found comfort in your constancy, that freedom can look like emotional unavailability, even when it is simply self-respect taking shape. Number 6. She doesn't know what you're thinking. What unsettles her most now isn't distance itself, but the loss of access to your inner world. There was a time when your thoughts were easy to read because you made them available. You explained how you felt, clarified misunderstandings, and filled in emotional gaps before they had a chance to grow into uncertainty. When something felt off, you addressed it directly. When tension appeared, you translated it into words. That transparency made the dynamic feel safe, because nothing was left undefined for long. But that version of you no longer leads the interaction. You haven't become cold or detached in a defensive way. You haven't closed yourself off emotionally out of bitterness. What has changed is the discipline behind your energy. You no longer narrate your internal state for the sake of reassurance. You no longer feel compelled to clarify emotions that don't require explanation. Your responses are calm, measured, and intentional, not designed to manage someone else's uncertainty or guide them toward comfort. And that restraint creates ambiguity. She can no longer tell what you're thinking by the tone of your messages or the length of your explanations. There are no emotional breadcrumbs to follow, no oversharing to interpret, no spontaneous reactions to decode. Your presence feels solid but quiet, and without emotional performance to read, she's left with space. Space to wonder, space to project, space to second-guess past assumptions. That stillness is deeply unsettling to someone who once relied on emotional transparency to stay oriented. In the absence of explanation, the mind fills in gaps on its own. She may replay conversations, search for meaning in pauses, or question whether she misread you entirely before. The lack of clarity forces her to confront uncertainty rather than dissolve it through dialogue. And because she no longer has access to your internal processing, she can't predict where you stand or how you'll respond. This is not manipulation. It's containment. Stoic philosophy values clarity within the self, not constant explanation outward. A disciplined mind doesn't broadcast every movement. It remains grounded regardless of external pressure. By choosing stillness, you've become stable rather than expressive, anchored rather than reactive. Like a rock against the waves, you remain unmoved, not because the waves don't exist, but because you no longer allow them to dictate your position. And in that steadiness, you've become unreadable not as a strategy, but as a result of inner order. As you sit with this shift, notice what it reveals about where real power actually comes from. When expression gives way to steadiness, and explanation gives way to presence. The dynamic changes in ways that can't be undone. Take a moment to reflect on how this kind of inner containment has shown up in your own life, where you stopped narrating and simply stood firm. If this resonates, tap like to support the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Or, if you prefer silence with meaning, simply type, "I've mastered myself," and let that be your mark before we move on. Number 7. She can't find the door back. What confuses her most is that nothing dramatic marked the ending. There was no final argument, no harsh goodbye, no moment she can point to and say, "This is where everything closed." You didn't slam the door in anger or make a statement meant to be remembered. From her perspective, the connection simply quieted. Distance appeared without confrontation, and silence settled in without explanation. Because of that, she assumed the door was still there, maybe slightly ajar, maybe harder to open, but not gone. That assumption is what leads her to reach out now. When she does, she isn't expecting resistance. She expects familiarity, a conversation that picks up where it left off, or at least a recognizable emotional pathway back into your world. In the past, even pauses ended with reconnection. Silence was temporary. Space was reversible. She believed time alone was enough to keep access intact. What she didn't see was what happened to you during that quiet. You weren't closing yourself off out of spite, and you weren't creating distance as a test. You were moving forward internally. As you rebuilt your sense of balance, you stopped organizing your emotional world around potential returns. The door didn't close because of a decision aimed at her. It closed because your life no longer revolved around keeping it open. And in that process, the handle disappeared. Not violently removed, not ceremonially destroyed, but simply no longer necessary. Now when she reaches for it, there's nothing to grab. That absence can feel like rejection to her, but it isn't punishment. You aren't withholding access to make a point or demand remorse. You're not replaying the past or guarding against it. You've just grown past the version of yourself that left emotional doors unlocked indefinitely. What once felt like openness has been replaced by discernment. This is the difference between bitterness and peace. A man rooted in peace doesn't burn bridges in moments of emotion, because destruction still implies attachment. Instead, he stops investing energy where it no longer flows both ways. He doesn't chase closure, and he doesn't create barriers out of resentment. He simply stops building paths that lead nowhere. And to someone who once relied on easy access, that quiet finality can feel more unsettling than a slammed door ever could. You didn't take anything away. You just stopped offering what was never meant to be permanent. Number 8. She's feeling the void. She didn't notice the weight of your presence while it was there, not because it lacked value, but because it was constant. Your attention, your steadiness, your emotional availability blended into the background of her experience, quietly supporting the dynamic without asking to be acknowledged. Like anything that remains stable for too long, it became part of the environment rather than something to be felt. Its absence is what finally gives it shape. Only now does the space appear. At first, the void doesn't announce itself as loss. It arrives as restlessness, a subtle awareness that something familiar is no longer there to lean on. She may catch herself replaying conversations, re-examining moments that once felt ordinary, searching for clues she didn't think she needed at the time. Not because she suddenly understands everything differently, but because the absence has created room for reflection she never had before. Without your presence to absorb emotional weight, the mind turns inward. She wonders if you're truly gone or simply distant. She tries to sense your energy in familiar places, in old patterns, in the memory of how it once felt to reach you effortlessly. But instead of warmth, she finds space, not dramatic silence, not tension. Just emptiness where something stable used to be. And that emptiness is unsettling precisely because it offers no resistance and no reassurance. This is where the void becomes real. The space you've created isn't silence meant to provoke or punish. It isn't absence used as leverage. It's the natural result of self-respect taking form. When you withdrew your energy, you didn't leave chaos behind. You left clarity. The void exists because you are no longer filling gaps that were never yours to carry alone. That realization often comes too late. She begins to feel the difference between being chosen and being accommodated, between presence freely given and presence that comes from inner alignment. And in that contrast, your absence grows heavier than your presence ever was. Not because you were more valuable when gone, because the value was finally revealed through its removal. Hierocles spoke of the soul needing to center itself before extending outward, and that is exactly what you've done. You didn't disappear emotionally, you recentered. You stopped reaching beyond yourself to stabilize someone else's uncertainty. And in doing so, you left behind a void that can't be filled by memory or imagination, only by understanding what was once taken for granted. Number 9. She thought you'd wait. She never consciously decided to take you for granted. In her mind, your emotional loyalty felt like something solid and enduring, something that didn't require urgency or careful handling. You had shown patience before. You had forgiven quickly. You had stayed present, even when the connection felt uncertain or uneven. Over time, that pattern created an assumption that your availability wasn't tied to timing, effort, or alignment, but to who you were as a person. Waiting felt built into your role. She believed that no matter how much space passed between you, there would always be a version of you standing in the same place, ready to reconnect, ready to rebuild, ready to forgive without question. Emotional loyalty, as she understood it, meant permanence. It meant that distance could be explored without consequence, because your presence would remain untouched by time or hesitation. What she misunderstood was the difference between patience and postponement. Detachment isn't something that happens all at once, and it isn't announced when it begins. While she assumed time was neutral, you were changing quietly. Each moment of distance became less about waiting and more about adjusting your inner posture. You weren't counting days or measuring silence. You were recalibrating. And with every recalibration, the version of yourself that needed her clarity, reassurance, or decision began to fade. By the time she noticed the shift, it was already complete. From her perspective, it feels sudden. One day, you were accessible, and the next, you were no longer available in the same way. But the change didn't happen overnight. It happened internally, through a series of small decisions where you chose peace over anticipation, self-respect over emotional suspension. Waiting stopped being an option, not because of anger, but because it no longer made sense. This is where detachment is often misunderstood. It isn't a pause meant to trigger regret or urgency. It isn't a tactic designed to bring someone back. Detachment is a decision to stop orbiting uncertainty. And once that decision is made, there is no version of the past to return to. You didn't walk away in protest, you stopped walking in circles. Stoic philosophy captures this clearly. A disciplined man doesn't threaten departure to gain leverage. He doesn't announce boundaries to create fear. He simply redirects his movement toward what aligns with his values. And when that happens, those who assumed he would always be waiting are left realizing that time didn't stand still for him, it moved him forward. Take a moment to sit with what you just heard. Not to judge her, and not to relive the past, but to notice the shift in you. Ask yourself when waiting quietly turned into choosing peace, when patience stopped feeling aligned and started feeling like self-betrayal. This is the point many men overlook, because it happens internally. without drama or announcement. If this resonates, reflect on where you stopped orbiting uncertainty in your own life. And if you're comfortable, leave a comment sharing what changed for you, or simply write, "I chose forward." Let's explore what's coming up next in this journey. Number 10. She's lost without your energy. What she feels now goes deeper than missing conversations or familiar words. What's missing is the effect your presence had on her inner world. When you were there, things felt steadier, even when life around her wasn't. Your energy carried a quiet, grounding quality, one that didn't try to fix her emotions but softened them simply by existing. You weren't loud reassurance or constant advice. You were consistency, and consistency has a way of calming storms without announcing that it's doing so. At the time, that peace blended into the background. She didn't notice how often her uncertainty settled when you were present, or how her emotional fluctuations felt smaller when they had something stable to move against. Your presence acted like a stabilizing field, not controlling, not demanding, just steady enough to hold things in place. And because it was always there, it never felt fragile or at risk of disappearing. Now that energy is gone. Without it, her own emotional noise feels amplified. Doubts linger longer. Questions spiral without interruption. The internal storms that once passed more quietly now feel louder, more exposed. There's no familiar calm to lean into, no external steadiness to borrow when her own balance wavers. And while she may not consciously trace that shift back to you, she feels the difference in her body and mind. This is where absence becomes unmistakable. She may replay moments where your presence was available without conditions, not realizing at the time how rare that kind of grounded energy was. What once felt ordinary now feels irreplaceable, not because you were perfect, but because your calm didn't demand attention. It simply existed. And when that kind of peace is removed, the contrast is immediate. Detachment, in this sense, isn't emotional coldness. It isn't withdrawal meant to punish or create longing. It's the act of protecting what you carry inside. You didn't stop offering energy out of spite. You stopped giving it where it was being used as emotional shelter without appreciation or reciprocity. By choosing distance, you preserved your balance instead of continuing to absorb storms that were never yours to manage. And while she may not name it directly, the loss she feels isn't about connection. It's about the grounding force she once overlooked, now gone. Number 11. You changed the story. For a long time, she believed the story had already been written. In her version, she was the one who ended things, the one who made the decision that set everything in motion. You existed in that narrative as the man who was left behind, the one who would eventually process the ending, feel the loss, and perhaps linger emotionally where the connection once lived. That assumption allowed her to move forward without fully questioning how the story might evolve once it was no longer under her control. What she didn't anticipate was that distance could rewrite meaning. Your silence didn't argue with the past or try to reclaim it. It didn't challenge her decision or attempt to reshape the narrative through explanation. Instead, it shifted the frame entirely. By choosing distance, you removed yourself from the role she assigned you. You stopped performing the part of the man who was waiting, hoping, or emotionally tethered to an ending he didn't choose. In that quiet withdrawal, the story changed direction. You became the one who let go. Not dramatically, not with declarations or final statements meant to be remembered, but with clarity, with an internal decision that didn't need external validation. And that subtlety is what makes it powerful. There was no moment she could point to as closure, no emotional scene that sealed the ending. The shift happened quietly, and because of that, its impact lingered. Only in stillness does the real loss register. When you no longer occupied the emotional space of the one who was left, she was forced to confront a different reality. The absence wasn't loud enough to be dismissed, and it wasn't chaotic enough to be blamed on emotion. It was calm, final. And calm has a way of revealing truth without argument. In that stillness, she feels the loss not of control or connection, but of the version of the story where she remained central. This is where peace becomes the closing chapter. Stoic thought reminds us that fulfillment doesn't come from revisiting what has already passed, but from committing fully to what stands in front of us. Your task is no longer to be understood or remembered correctly. It is to live aligned with your present values. By choosing peace, you didn't just end a chapter, you stepped into authorship of your own life. And that is the part of the story she can no longer rewrite. And this is where everything comes to rest, not in resolution, but in truth. Emotional distance didn't make you colder. It made you clearer. It didn't erase feeling. It refined it. What unsettled her wasn't your absence, but the fact that you no longer needed to be understood to move forward. Your silence wasn't a reaction. It was a decision. And in choosing calm over explanation, alignment over attachment, you stepped out of the old dynamic entirely. That's the quiet power of Stoic presence. When you stop performing emotion and start living from inner order, the story changes without you having to say a word. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to like the video. It helps this message reach the men who need it most. Leave a comment sharing what stood out to you as a reminder of the standard you're living by now. And when you're ready, continue the journey by watching the recommended videos on screen. This is where growth deepens and where silence turns into strength. Sometimes, regret doesn't arrive when you're broken. It arrives when you're whole. It doesn't appear in the chaos, but in the calm you've chosen for yourself. In today's video, we'll explore why her regret only comes when your energy is no longer available, and why this always happens when a Stoic man detaches, grows, and moves forward. If you find this valuable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's begin. Number 1. The message that comes too late. It usually doesn't happen with fireworks. No dramatic paragraph. No confession. That sounds like a movie. It's often a simple message that arrives at the worst possible time for her, and the best possible time for your peace. Hey, how have you been? A casual line that tries to reopen a door as if it never fully closed. And what makes it feel almost surreal is the timing. She reaches out only after your silence has stopped being a strategy and turned into a lifestyle. You're not doing no contact anymore. You're just living. You're not counting days. You're building days. In her mind, your absence was supposed to be temporary, like a storm that passes and then the old routine returns. She assumed you were still somewhere behind that emotional door, hurt, waiting, ready to respond the moment she knocked. That assumption is the real reason the message comes late, because she didn't expect your silence to evolve into independence. She didn't expect you to become the kind of man who doesn't need closure to move forward. And when that message finally lands on your phone, it carries a hidden expectation. Not just talk to me, but prove to me I still matter. That's why it's rarely direct. It tests the water. It seeks confirmation without risking vulnerability. Because deep down, she wants to know if she still has access. If the old dynamic is still available, if she can step back into your life without accounting for what it cost you the first time. But the late message meets a man who is no longer in the same emotional place. Your silence isn't sharp. It isn't bitter. It's calm. And calm is terrifying to someone who expected noise. Because noise means attachment. Noise means reaction. Calm means you've made peace with reality. Calm means you've accepted what happened, and acceptance is the one thing she can't reverse. This is where Musonius Rufus becomes more than a quote. We don't live to be noticed. That idea sounds simple until it becomes real in a moment like this. You didn't detach to create a reaction. You didn't withdraw to be chased. You didn't perform absence to make her panic. You walked away because you chose virtue over validation, because you refused to live as a man who needs to be chosen to feel worthy. Musonius taught that character isn't built in comfort. It's built in discipline. And the discipline here is emotional. The ability to keep moving without checking who's watching. That's the part she didn't anticipate. She expected your silence to be a signal, but it became your standard, a way of life, a new identity. So when her message arrives late, it doesn't hit you like a temptation. It hits like an echo from a past version of yourself. And that's when she feels the real loss, not because you didn't reply fast enough, but because she can sense something has changed. The door she assumed was still open isn't locked with anger. It's simply no longer yours to guard. You've walked forward, and you didn't look back to see who noticed. Number 2, you've become emotionally expensive. Most men think value is something you prove with effort, so they give more. They explain more. They tolerate more. They stay present even when the other person becomes careless with their presence. And for a while, that seems noble until you realize what it teaches the other person, that your attention is always available, no matter how it's treated. That's what makes you cheap emotionally, not because you lack worth, but because you hand out your access without requiring any standard in return. At one point, you did that. You were generous with your presence. You showed up quickly. You forgave quickly. You adjusted quickly. Even when she mishandled you through inconsistency, mixed signals, or emotional laziness, you still offered the same version of yourself. You didn't make her earn alignment. You assumed history was enough. You assumed chemistry was enough. You assumed the good moments would eventually pull everything else into place. But then, something changed. And it wasn't a new tactic. It wasn't a game. It was a boundary that came from clarity. You realized that your time, your attention, your emotional steadiness, those things are not freebies. They're investments. And investments require discernment. Now, access to you isn't earned by what we used to be. It's earned by what she brings now. Alignment, not nostalgia. This is why, when she comes back around, she feels a new distance she can't quite name. She may still have memories. She may still feel attachment. She may still believe she has a place in your life. But she runs into a quiet reality. You've become emotionally expensive, not in an arrogant way, in a disciplined way. The same way a man becomes expensive when he stops wasting his energy on things that don't return peace. And that's where Hierocles fits perfectly. He described life in circles of concern, starting with the self at the center, then moving outward to family, community, strangers. The lesson isn't to become cold. The lesson is to place people where their behavior has earned them the right to be placed. At one time, she stood close to your center. Your concern for her was immediate. Your patience was deep. Your availability was generous. Now she's in a different ring. Not because you hate her, not because you're punishing her, but because she showed you through actions, not words, how much care she could actually hold without dropping it. And once you see that, you don't keep handing someone delicate value they keep mishandling. You move them outward to where their energy belongs. This shift creates a specific kind of regret in her, because she can feel that your life has become structured, protected, quietly selective. And she realizes she's no longer dealing with a man who is hoping to be chosen. She's dealing with a man who chooses. So, when she tries to return with the same casual access she once had, she feels the difference immediately. You're polite, but not open. Calm, but not available. Respectful, but not reachable in the old way. And that's when it hits her. You didn't become distant to make her value you. You became disciplined because you finally valued yourself. You're not hard to get. You're hard to keep because you require alignment. And that's what makes her regret arrive later. She didn't lose a man who needed her. She lost a man who learned to need peace more than history. Before we move on, take a moment to sit with what you just heard. This isn't about punishment, ego, or playing roles. It's about the quiet shift that happens when a man finally recognizes the value of his own presence. That realization doesn't announce itself loudly, but it changes everything beneath the surface. If this resonates with you, leave a comment sharing what stood out most, or simply type, "I choose alignment over history." Sometimes, naming the shift is how you fully step into it. Number 3. She thought time was on her side. One of the quietest mistakes in love is assuming time is unlimited, not calendar time, but emotional time. The time when someone's heart is still open, patience still warm, hope still alive. She believed she had plenty of it. She thought she could delay decisions, stay uncertain, keep you in a gray zone, and return later as if nothing would change. In her mind, you were stable, predictable, always there in the background. So, she hesitated. She explored other options, let things drift, or told herself she'd figure it out later. Maybe she wasn't trying to hurt you. Maybe she was just confused. But confusion doesn't erase impact. While she hesitated, you began to heal. Healing is dangerous for the person who benefited from your unhealed attachment. An unhealed man waits, hopes, overthinks. A healed man becomes clear. He stops excusing inconsistency. He stops searching for signs. He builds a life that doesn't require emotional permission. At first, she doesn't notice the shift. Healing doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly in better habits, stronger focus, renewed purpose, and silence that no longer hurts. Each day she delays, you become less reachable, not from coldness, but from wholeness. Then she looks back, expecting the old version of you, the man who answered quickly, who made space for uncertainty. And that's when it hits. Time didn't preserve you. Time changed you. She thought time was on her side, but it was on yours. While she waited for the perfect moment, you became whole. And in doing so, you outgrew her. Cleanthes compared life to a festival. You arrive, participate fully, and leave when your part is done without bitterness or chaos. That's what you did. You didn't create drama. You simply recognized the season had ended and walked away with dignity. That's why her regret arrives late. She expected emotion to keep you tethered. Instead, you moved on cleanly, not out of anger, but out of respect for time. So when she tries to return, it isn't hatred that stops you. You're just no longer living in the same emotional timeline. She arrives with yesterday's mindset, expecting yesterday's access while you're already living in tomorrow's discipline. Late regret is realizing you had time, but used it wrong, because while she hesitated, you healed. And once a man heals, he doesn't move backward to make someone else comfortable. He keeps moving forward, grateful for what was, but not begging for what's over. Number 4. The absence that echoes louder. Your silence said more than your presence ever could, and not because you wanted to send a message. It said more because you stopped providing the background noise that used to keep everything feeling normal. When you were there, you absorbed tension. You filled gaps. You gave reassurance without being asked. You responded quickly enough that uncertainty never had time to grow teeth. And over time, she started confusing your consistency with permanence. Then you went quiet. No long explanation. No dramatic exit. No angry paragraphs designed to make her feel guilty. Just stillness. And stillness has a strange power. It doesn't argue. It doesn't defend itself. It doesn't negotiate. It simply sits there like a mirror. The moment you removed your voice, she was forced to sit with her own. and that's when the echo began. At first, she may have felt relief, space, a break from having to respond, but silence doesn't stay neutral. As days pass, it becomes a question that keeps repeating in the mind. Why isn't he reacting? Most people expect a man to chase, to check in, to demand closure, to show emotion in a way that keeps the bond alive. When none of that happens, the brain starts searching for meaning. And the meaning it often lands on is this: you didn't disappear because you were weak. You disappeared because you were done. That's what makes the absence echo louder. It isn't loud on the outside, but it becomes loud on the inside. Every time she reaches for the old version of you available, forgiving, steady, she runs into a wall of calm. And calm is more unsettling than anger, because anger proves attachment. Calm suggests acceptance. This is where Chrysippus fits perfectly. He argued that harmony is the natural order of things, and that inner conflict comes from resisting reality. Your disappearance wasn't an emotional attack, it was a correction. You stopped forcing harmony where it didn't exist. You stopped bending your peace to fit someone else's confusion. By stepping back, you restored your inner order, and the moment your harmony returned, her imbalance became impossible to ignore. Because she had been leaning on your steadiness without realizing it, your silence didn't punish her. It revealed her. It revealed the dynamic. And once silence becomes a man's natural state, quiet, grounded, not performative, it doesn't just create distance, it creates weight. Number 5. Your growth made you invisible. When she looks back toward you, she isn't looking for who you are now. She's looking for the version of you she remembers, the man who was emotionally available, predictable, shaped by the dynamic the two of you once shared. That version made sense to her. She knew how to reach him. She knew what buttons to press, what tone to use, what moments would pull him closer. In her mind, that man still exists somewhere, waiting to be rediscovered. But growth doesn't announce itself in ways that are easy to recognize. Real growth is quiet. It doesn't posture. It doesn't seek acknowledgement. It simply changes the altitude you live at. And once you rise above a certain level, people who knew you in an earlier phase can no longer see you clearly. Not because you're hiding, but because their perspective never moved with you. While she was focused on her own timeline, you were rebuilding from the inside out. You weren't just getting over something. You were reshaping how you relate to your own energy, your standards, your peace. You learned how to be alone without feeling empty. You learned how to sit with silence without needing to fill it. You learned that not every emotional impulse deserves expression, and not every invitation deserves a response. That kind of discipline changes a man's presence entirely, and this is where confusion sets in for her. She senses that something is different, but she can't quite place it. Your voice sounds the same, but it doesn't reach for her. Your responses, if they exist at all, are measured. There's no emotional pull, no gravity she can latch onto. To her, it feels like you've become distant. In reality, you've become self-contained. And a self-contained man is nearly invisible to someone who only knew how to connect through need, uncertainty, or emotional leverage. That's why she struggles to recognize you. Growth has erased the version of you she had access to, not erased with anger, but replaced with clarity. You no longer orbit her emotional state. You no longer react in ways that make you legible. You've moved beyond the frame she used to understand you. Posidonius understood this kind of choice deeply. He declined public power not because he feared it, but because he valued inner mastery more. He knew that influence over oneself outweighs influence over others. In the same way, you declined her return not out of resentment, but because it required you to abandon the inner order you worked hard to build. To her, it feels like you vanished. But the truth is simpler and more unsettling. You didn't disappear. You evolved. And once a man evolves beyond the emotional level where someone last knew him, he doesn't need to explain himself. He doesn't need to be recognized. Peace becomes the reward. And peace doesn't make a man visible to everyone. It only makes him clear to himself. Take a moment to sit with that idea before we move on. Not to judge it, not to defend it, but to honestly feel the shift it points to. Growth doesn't always look like motion. Sometimes it looks like stillness that can no longer be pulled. And when you realize you've changed in ways that no longer need validation, something subtle clicks into place. Reflect on what part of you no longer fits the old frame and what that has cost or protected in your life. If this resonates, leave a comment sharing what stood out to you, or simply type "My control is within" in the comments. Sometimes naming the shift is how you fully claim it. Number 6. Regret hates a man who no longer needs her. Regret doesn't grow in chaos. It grows in contrast. And nothing creates sharper contrast than a man who no longer needs the person who once defined his emotional world. When she looks at you now, the discomfort isn't just about what she lost, it's about what no longer works. The old levers of guilt, nostalgia, or emotional pull don't move you anymore. And that unsettles her far more than anger ever could. At one time, her presence mattered deeply to you. It shaped your mood. It influenced your decisions. Her attention felt like proof that you were valued. That dependence, even if it was quiet, gave her a kind of emotional gravity. If she pulled away, you felt it. If she returned, you responded. And because of that, regret could survive in her heart. She could feel conflicted, unsure, even guilty, because she still felt needed. But detachment changes the entire emotional economy. When a man no longer depends on her, regret loses its footing. There's nothing to repair, nothing to compensate for, nothing to fix. She can't ease her conscience by re-entering your life, because your life is no longer waiting for her presence to feel complete. Your calm doesn't invite explanation. Your steadiness doesn't ask for reassurance. And that's why her regret has nowhere to land. This isn't rejection. Rejection still acknowledges importance. Rejection says, "You matter enough for me to push you away." Detachment says something quieter and far more final. "I don't need to push you anywhere. I've already moved." That distinction is critical. Your strength isn't in withholding affection to provoke emotion. It's in removing dependency so your peace isn't negotiable. From her perspective, this feels like emotional exile, not because you banished her, but because she can no longer influence your internal state. She may sense guilt, curiosity, or even longing, but those emotions echo back to her, unanswered. And over time, that echo becomes heavy, because regret wants engagement. It wants reaction. It wants proof that it still matters. Arius Didymus understood this restraint well. He wrote that the wise man neither celebrates gains nor weeps for losses, not because he is numb, but because he is anchored. You didn't deny the loss. You accepted it. And in accepting it, you gained something far more durable than reconciliation. Self-possession. You lost her, but you gained yourself. That gain changes how you move, how you speak, how you carry silence. And when a man carries himself without emotional need, regret has no power over him. It can circle, it can linger, but it cannot enter. And that's what makes her regret feel so sharp. Not that you rejected her, but that you no longer require her to feel whole. Number 7. You stopped speaking her language, neediness. When she comes back, she expects a familiar rhythm, a certain tone, a predictable emotional accent. She expects hesitation, hope, a trace of longing beneath your words. That was the language you used to speak without realizing it. The language of neediness, not desperation, but availability without direction, openness without structure, emotion without containment. It made you easy to read, easy to reach, easy to re-enter. But that language is gone now. She notices it almost immediately. The conversation doesn't flow the way it used to. Your words don't circle her emotions. You don't fish for reassurance. You don't lean forward energetically, trying to reconnect the past. There's no emotional urgency behind your responses. What replaces it feels foreign to her. Pauses, clarity, restraint. You speak in boundaries now, in intention, in direction, and to someone who was fluent in your old emotional patterns. This feels like talking to a stranger. That's because neediness isn't just behavior, it's a dialect. It's a way of signaling, I'm here, I'm open, I'm waiting. When you stop speaking it, the entire dynamic breaks down. She can no longer predict you. She can no longer guide the interaction toward comfort or familiarity. And without that leverage, she's forced to confront something uncomfortable. You're no longer orienting your inner world around her responses. This shift didn't happen overnight. It came from heartbreak that forced you inward, from long stretches of silence where you had to sit with yourself instead of seeking relief through connection, from learning how to choose peace even when the mind wants closure. Slowly, longing lost its voice, and in its place, direction emerged. You started asking different questions, not, how do I get this back, but where am I going now? That's why the old script fails when she tries to replay it. The cues don't work, the timing feels off, the emotional beats land on empty space. You're not cold, you're oriented. And orientation is intimidating to someone who expected emotional pull. Zeno of Citium understood this kind of transformation deeply. After losing everything in a shipwreck, he didn't attempt to reconstruct what was destroyed. He didn't chase the past. He built something entirely new, philosophy itself on the ruins of what he'd lost. Loss didn't make him desperate. It made him deliberate. Your heartbreak did the same. It stripped you of familiar language and forced you to develop a new one rooted in self-direction rather than emotional dependence. So, when she returns, hoping to speak the language you once shared, she realizes too late. You're no longer fluent in neediness. You're fluent in self-command. And that conversation doesn't invite longing, it establishes distance, clarity, and forward motion. Let this shift settle for a second. When the language of neediness fades, the entire dynamic changes without a word being spoken. Notice where your attention is now, and what it feels like to no longer orient yourself around someone else's responses. If this resonates, share your thoughts in the comments and reflect on what changed when you stopped speaking your old emotional language. Number 8. She can't compete with your peace. For a long time, she believed replacement was inevitable, that if you stopped mattering, someone else would simply take your place. A new face, a new dynamic, a new distraction. From her perspective, people are interchangeable when attachment fades. What she didn't understand is that she wasn't competing with another person anymore. She was competing with a state of being. And no one competes successfully with peace. When you were emotionally invested, comparison made sense. Another option could create jealousy. Attention could shift. Presence could be replaced. But once you stepped back and rebuilt your inner world, the rules changed. Your fulfillment stopped, depending on external validation. Your calm didn't come from being chosen. It came from choosing yourself. And that kind of peace doesn't create openings for rivalry. It closes the door entirely. This is why her return feels awkward and misaligned. She expects to measure herself against someone else, another woman, another influence, another distraction. Instead, she runs into your steadiness, your routines, your emotional containment, your lack of urgency. She can't provoke you. She can't outperform your calm. And she can't offer something louder than silence that is already settled. Peace is intimidating because it doesn't negotiate, it doesn't bargain. It doesn't ask for permission to exist. When a man finds it, he stops chasing stimulation just to feel alive. He stops mistaking intensity for meaning. And from the outside, that looks like distance, but from the inside, it feels like freedom. This is where Epictetus becomes essential. When he said, "Only the educated are free," he wasn't talking about books or status. He was talking about mastery of the self. The education that matters most is learning how not to be ruled by impulse, craving, or fear of loss. You learned that lesson the hard way, through silence, through restraint, through choosing not to reach back, just to soothe discomfort. That education changed what you value. Presence without peace no longer interests you. Attention without alignment feels expensive. So when she realizes she can't compete, it isn't because she lacks something, it's because you no longer need anything she's offering. You didn't choose peace because it was easy. You chose it because chaos was familiar and you refused to live there anymore. And once peace becomes your baseline, it quietly disqualifies every dynamic that requires you to abandon it. That's when her regret sharpens. Not because she lost a man to someone else, but because she lost him to himself. Number 9. Her memory is rewriting history. At some point, something subtle shifts inside her. The memories she once dismissed begin to change shape. Moments she labeled as too much now feel thoughtful. What she once called boring starts to look steady. The patience she took for granted begins to resemble strength. This isn't nostalgia, it's reinterpretation, and it happens only after distance has done its work. When you were present, your consistency blended into the background. Reliability is rarely appreciated in real time. It feels ordinary when it's available on demand. Only absence gives it contrast. Without your voice, your routines, your steady emotional tone, her mind starts filling the silence by replaying the past, but this time without the pressure of the moment. Without ego, without the need to justify leaving. That's when memory becomes honest. She remembers how you didn't escalate conflict, how you stayed calm when things were uncertain, how you didn't need constant reassurance to remain grounded. Those traits didn't feel exciting when she was still choosing, but now, in hindsight, they feel rare, because the world is full of intensity, but short on stability, full of noise, but empty of presence. This rewriting of history isn't deliberate, it's psychological. When something is gone and can't be accessed anymore, the mind reassesses its value more accurately. She's no longer comparing you to alternatives, she's comparing you to reality. And reality reveals the gap. What intensifies the regret is realizing that your transformation didn't happen despite her leaving. It happened because of it. Her exit removed resistance. It forced you into stillness, into reflection, into growth that didn't require her validation. You didn't argue with what happened. You used it. Marcus Aurelius captured this perfectly when he wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What blocked your path became the path. The loss became leverage. The silence became structure. You didn't collapse inward, you reorganized outward. You learned how to move without emotional friction, how to live without explaining yourself." Now, when she looks back, she sees a man who was already becoming something she didn't recognize at the time, and that realization stings. Because regret deepens when memory aligns with truth too late. You weren't excessive, you were rare. You weren't dull, you were anchored. And the irony is this: she couldn't see it while she still had access. Only when you were gone did clarity arrive. And by then, the version of you she remembers no longer exists. Number 10. The door she once closed now has no handle. When she finally decides to return, she does so with an assumption she never questioned before, that the path back to you still exists. Maybe narrower, maybe quieter, but still open. In her mind, doors can be reopened simply because time has passed or feelings have softened. What she doesn't anticipate is the moment she reaches for the handle and realizes there isn't one. Not because you're angry, not because you want revenge, but because you quietly removed it. When the door was closed the first time, it wasn't slammed in a dramatic way. It ended with distance, hesitation, maybe indifference, and for a long time, she believed that meant reversibility. That silence was temporary, that the space you created was something she could step back into once she was ready. What she didn't see was what that silence was doing to you. In the absence of contact, you weren't plotting a return. You were stabilizing. You were learning how to exist without waiting. You rebuilt routines that didn't revolve around anticipation. You stopped checking emotional weather before deciding how to feel. And slowly, almost without noticing, you redesigned your inner space so it no longer needed that door at all. Removing the handle wasn't an act against her. It was an act for yourself. People often mistake boundaries for punishment, but punishment still centers the other person. Boundaries center peace. You didn't lock the door to keep her out. You dismantled the mechanism that allowed old patterns to pull you back in. Because every time you reached back before, it cost you clarity. It cost you balance. And this time, you chose not to pay that price again. This is where the Stoic idea of eupatheiai matters. These are not suppressed emotions, but well-ordered ones, calm, goodwill, and inner steadiness. Strength, in this sense, isn't intensity, it's regulation. You don't feel hatred. You don't feel the urge to prove anything. You simply don't feel compelled to reopen what once disrupted your inner order. From her perspective, this feels confusing. She expects resistance, emotion, explanation, something to push against. Instead, she finds nothing to grab onto, no argument, no invitation, no leverage. And that absence feels final in a way anger never could. You didn't erase her. You didn't deny the past. You just stopped reaching back. And that's what makes this moment so heavy for her. The door she once closed doesn't open anymore, not because it's locked, but because you no longer live on the other side. You moved forward. You protected your peace. And in doing so, you turned detachment into quiet strength. What matters now isn't whether she understands why the door no longer opens. It's whether you understand what changed inside you when you stopped needing it to. This is the moment where detachment stops being an idea and becomes a lived reality, where you can look back without being pulled backward. Take a breath here and reflect on that shift. The point where peace replaced anticipation and stability replaced hope. If this resonates, sit with it for a moment. Let it land. And if you feel it, share your reflection in the comments. Sometimes naming the change is how you fully claim it. Number 11. You don't chase ghosts, you build forward. At the end of all this, something becomes very clear. Her regret belongs to her, not to you, not to the version of you that once waited, explained, or hoped things would change. That man doesn't exist anymore. And because of that, you're no longer tempted to chase what's already gone. You don't argue with the past. You don't negotiate with memories. You don't reopen chapters just to see how they end again. You understand something now that most people learn too late. Regret is a personal burden. It can't be transferred. It can't be resolved by someone else's presence. And it definitely can't be healed by a man who has already moved forward. Her reflections, her what-ifs, her late clarity, those are hers to sit with. You don't carry them for her anymore. This is the real shift. You're no longer walking backward through old conversations, old moments, old emotional loops. You're not replaying scenes to see what you could have said differently. That backward motion drains life. It keeps a man tied to ghosts, versions of people that no longer exist, futures that never arrived. You stepped out of that pattern when you chose to invest your energy ahead of you instead of behind you. Building forward feels quieter than chasing closure, but it's infinitely stronger. Forward motion doesn't need validation. It doesn't require permission. It asks only for consistency. You wake up, you act with intention. You place your energy where it compounds instead of leaks. And slowly, almost invisibly, a new structure forms around your life, one that isn't shaped by loss, but by direction. That's why her regret no longer pulls at you. It has no leverage over a man who is occupied with growth. Not performative growth, not look at me, progress. Real construction habits, purpose, self-respect, and peace that doesn't collapse when someone looks away. Seneca captured this truth with brutal simplicity. Life is long if you know how to use it. Most people don't waste life in dramatic ways. They waste it by revisiting what didn't choose them, by reopening doors that led nowhere, by spending emotional energy trying to be understood by people who already decided not to understand. You stopped doing that. You didn't become bitter. You became efficient with your time. You didn't harden your heart. You sharpened your focus. And because of that, the past lost its grip. Her regret may still echo somewhere behind you, but you don't turn around to listen. You're not chasing ghosts anymore. You're building something real. And a man who is building forward doesn't need closure from the past because his life is finally moving in the right direction. Sometimes the most powerful ending isn't dramatic, it's quiet. You didn't win by getting the last word, the apology, or the return you once imagined. You won by becoming someone who no longer needed any of that to feel whole. Her regret arriving late isn't proof of your value, it's a side effect of your growth. You didn't detach to be remembered. You detached to move forward. And in doing so, you chose peace over repetition, direction over nostalgia, and self-respect over emotional noise. That choice is what changed everything. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to like the video. It helps more than you think. Leave a comment below and share what part of this journey stood out to you most. And when you're ready to keep building forward, watch the recommended videos on screen. They're the next step in protecting your peace and strengthening your path. She thought losing you was nothing. There was no fight, no dramatic goodbye, just a quiet drifting apart that felt reversible to her, as if nothing had truly ended. What she didn't realize is that when a man detaches without anger, begging, or explanation, he doesn't disappear. He becomes heavier in the mind. His absence carries unanswered questions, and those questions take up more space than his presence ever did. In this video, we'll break down what really happens when she underestimates your absence, and how quiet detachment doesn't punish it, reveals who you truly were all along. If this resonates with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more insights like this. Number 1. She thought you'd always be there. For a longer presence showed up without needing to be asked. You listened without keeping score. You stayed emotionally steady, even when things felt uncertain or uneven. That consistency created a sense of safety. Safety quietly turned into assumption. You became part of the emotional landscape rather than something she would. Not because you lacked depth or importance, but because it often fades into the background. When someone never tests the limit, they stop noticing the strength required to maintain it. This is where perception subtly shifts. What once felt grounding begins to feel ordinary. Your understanding, your emotional reliability, no longer registered as effort or intention. Instead, they blended into expectation. She didn't wake up one day deciding you were replaceable. The change happened gradually, without malice. Familiarity softened her awareness. The very traits that made you dependable also made you predictable in her eyes. And predictability often gets mistaken for permanence. She leaned on your presence, the way people lean on something they assume will never move. Epictetus warned against this kind of quiet attachment. Not because connection is wrong, but because the mind grows careless when it confuses familiarity with certainty. When something feels guaranteed, we stop engaging with it consciously. She relied on you emotionally without reflecting on the cost of that reliance, and without considering that your presence was a choice rather than an obligation. You became the wall without ever asking whether it could be removed. When you finally stepped back, the shift wasn't dramatic. There was no explosion, no immediate panic. What appeared instead was space, an unfamiliar silence where your steadiness used to be. That space slowly revealed something she hadn't noticed while you were there. The amount of emotional weight you had been carrying quietly, you provided, the stability you offered, the way your presence softened uncertainty without demanding recognition. Only in your absence did the structure of that support become visible. Detachment didn't punish her. It clarified the dynamic. By removing yourself, you didn't withdraw value, you exposed it. Stoic detachment isn't about disappearing out of resentment. It's about stepping out of roles that were never meant to be permanent. When you stopped being constantly available, she was forced to confront the difference between something that is chosen and something that is merely assumed. And that realization often arrives too late, not because she didn't care, but because she never thought she had to. Number 2. Losing you felt easy at first. At the beginning, losing you didn't feel heavy to her. There was no sharp ache, no sudden regret, no dramatic emotional collapse. What she felt instead was space, breathing room, a quiet sense of relief that came from no longer needing to manage expectations or emotional rhythms tied to your presence. In that early phase, absence often masquerades as freedom. Without immediate discomfort, the mind assumes it has made the right decision. And because nothing hurt right away, she interpreted that calm as certainty. This reaction isn't unusual. When emotional systems feel secure, they delay impact. The mind protects itself by minimizing meaning, especially when something familiar disappears without immediate consequences. She told herself she was fine, that this was easier than expected, that nothing essential had been lost. Control felt intact. The narrative made sense. You were gone, and yet life continued without interruption. From her perspective, the lack of instant pain confirmed that letting go had been simple. But this sense of ease was temporary, even if she didn't realize it. Early detachment often feels clean because the deeper layers haven't surfaced yet. Distraction fills the space quickly. Routine replaces reflection. External stimulation drowns out quieter signals. And in that noise, the absence of something meaningful doesn't register as absence at all. It registers as neutrality. She wasn't missing you yet, because the emotional weight you once carried hadn't returned to her consciousness. This is why a Stoic man doesn't rush to interpret early reactions. He understands that truth rarely announces itself immediately. Emotional reality unfolds on its own schedule, not according to expectations or timelines. Chasing reassurance in the early stages only interferes with that process. Silence, when grounded in self-respect rather than avoidance, allows time to do what force never can. As days passed and novelty faded, the structure you once provided began to reveal itself by contrast. Moments that were once buffered by your presence now stood exposed. Decisions felt slightly heavier. Emotional fluctuations had nowhere to land. The calm she initially felt slowly lost its clarity. Simply delay. Loss rarely arrives loudly. It enters quietly. After distraction weakens and certainty erodes. And when it finally surfaces, it doesn't ask permission. By the time she felt the weight of what had changed, the moment to treat it lightly had already passed. You didn't need to explain your absence for it to matter. By stepping back without reaction, you allowed reality to emerge naturally, revealing that what felt easy at first was only unexamined. Before we move on, take a moment to reflect on this. How many times have you mistaken early calm for only to realize later it was just delay? This is where Stoic silence matters most, because it gives reality time to surface without interference. If this hit home, leave a comment with what stood out to you, or simply type, "I don't react, I decide," below. Number 3. Your silence changed everything. What altered the dynamic wasn't something you said, but what you refused to say. You didn't argue your side or rush to correct her interpretation. You didn't send long explanations designed to preserve your image or soften the outcome. Instead, you went quiet, and in doing so, you removed the familiar pattern she expected, the back and forth, the emotional negotiation, the reassurance that you were still available to engage. That absence of response unsettled the entire structure more than any carefully chosen words ever could. Silence carries weight precisely because it resists control. When you speak, especially defensively, you give the other person something to respond to, reinterpret, or dismiss. Words invite debate. They allow narratives to be reshaped. But silence offers no such leverage. It doesn't clarify, apologize, or escalate. It simply stands. And in that stillness, assumptions lose their footing. She could no longer guide the story by provoking reaction, because there was nothing to push against. Marcus Aurelius believed that restraint reveals character more clearly than action. A man's discipline, especially in moments where reaction is expected, exposes his inner structure. By choosing silence, you demonstrated something she had never fully seen before: self-command. Not withdrawal rooted in bitterness, but composure rooted in self-respect. You showed that your sense of self didn't depend on being understood in that moment, and that unsettled her more than disagreement ever could. Silence became a mirror. Without your explanations to soften edges or redirect meaning, she was left alone with her own interpretations. What she saw, reflected back, wasn't something you imposed, it was something she couldn't manage. The quiet forced her to confront uncertainty. Was your silence indifference? Strength? Finality? The inability to categorize it created tension because the old emotional cues were gone. This is why silence changes everything. It removes interference. It allows reality to surface without commentary. In the absence of your words, your actions, or lack of them, spoke with clarity. You didn't need to declare boundaries. You embodied them. You didn't need to prove value. You stopped explaining it. And when someone loses the ability to influence a dynamic through reaction, they begin to feel the weight of what they can no longer reach. Your silence wasn't empty. It was structured. It carried intention without announcement. And in that quiet space, the truth of who you were, steady, grounded, no longer available for emotional negotiation, became impossible to ignore. Number 4. She expected you to reach out. In her mind, distance was never meant to be final. It was a lever, not a wall. She believed that space would create just enough tension to pull you back, and that silence would make you restless, uncertain, eager to restore connection. The pause wasn't designed to end anything. It was meant to test gravity. She expected a message, a check-in, some small signal that confirmed she still held emotional influence over you. That expectation wasn't arrogance, it was familiarity. In the past, distance had always worked that way. What she didn't anticipate was your restraint. You felt the pull. You noticed the quiet. You were aware of the moment where reaching out would have been easy, even justified. But instead of reacting to the urge, you sat with it. You allowed discomfort without rushing to resolve it. And that single choice, unseen, unannounced, changed the balance of the dynamic more than any confrontation ever could. Musonius Rufus taught that mastery isn't proven by the absence of desire, but by the refusal to obey it. Wanting connection doesn't make a man weak. Surrendering self-command does. You didn't pretend indifference. You practiced discipline. You chose not to let impulse dictate your behavior, even though no one would have blamed you for doing so. That internal decision marked a quiet shift from reaction to authorship. From her perspective, the expected signal never came, and without it, uncertainty crept in. The tension she created had nowhere to land. Instead of drawing you closer, it revealed something she hadn't considered: that your emotional center was no longer orbiting her responses. The absence of your outreach didn't feel like punishment, it felt like loss of leverage. And leverage, once gone, is deeply unsettling. This gravity reverses. When someone they're forced to reassess their position in the dynamic. Silence wasn't loud, but it was definitive. It suggested that your sense of direction no longer movement. That realization arrived as panic. It arrived as unease, a subtle awareness that the rules she thought governed the connection no longer applied. By not reaching out, you didn't escalate or withdraw dramatically. You simply stayed aligned, and in doing so, you demonstrated something rare: the ability to let go without trying to control their outcome. That composure quietly dismantled the expectations she relied on and revealed a version of you she hadn't fully accounted for until now. Number 5. You stepped back with dignity. Back. There was nothing theatrical about it. No sharp words meant to wound. No sudden coldness designed to trigger guilt or second-guessing. You didn't withdraw to punish her or to prove a point. You simply created distance and handled it cleanly. That restraint mattered more than you realized, because dignity has a way of speaking even when nothing is said aloud. People struggle with withdrawal because they confuse distance with hostility. They believe stepping back requires emotional armor, visible detachment, indifference. But what you did was different. You didn't erase warmth out of spite, nor did you replace closeness with bitterness. You allowed the connection to end without contaminating it with resentment. And that choice revealed something rare: emotional maturity that doesn't need an audience. Stoic philosophy emphasizes that dignity never announces itself. It doesn't posture or posture back. It moves like someone leaving a room without slamming the door. Your exit didn't create noise, but it created contrast. In the absence of drama, your calm stood out. There was no chaos to distract from the reality of your departure. No conflict to reinterpret later, just a clean break that forced clarity. That clarity lingered. When anger is present, it gives the other person something to push against, something to blame. But dignity removes that option. Your restraint denied her the comfort of labeling you as bitter, reactive, or emotionally unstable. Instead, what remained was a quiet awareness that you left intact. And that awareness tends to settle slowly, resurfacing in moments when distraction fades. Strength that doesn't demand recognition leaves a deeper imprint. Because it doesn't try to be remembered, it often is. Your composure rewrote the emotional narrative without explanation. You didn't need to declare boundaries. Your behavior embodied them. You didn't need to justify your distance. The manner in which you took it spoke for you. Over time, that kind of exit becomes difficult to forget. Not because it hurt loudly, but because it ended cleanly. It closed a chapter without damage, which paradoxically makes it harder to dismiss. When someone leaves with dignity, they don't leave behind confusion or resentment. They leave behind reflection. And reflection has a way of returning when least expected, carrying with it the realization that what was lost wasn't just presence, but character. That kind of silence is unforgettable not because it shouts, but because it lingers. When you walked away with composure instead of chaos, it left a mark that couldn't be erased by blame or distraction. That's the power of emotional discipline. It redefines the narrative without needing to argue. Before we move to what happens next in her mind, take a moment to reflect on this quiet strength. If this resonates with you, hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, or simply type, "My silence speaks clearly." Let's keep going. What she feels next might surprise you. Number 6. She lost access to you. What changed wasn't simply that you were gone, It was that she no longer had access. Before, even during distance or tension, there was still a line connecting her to your emotional state. Your reactions provided feedback. Your responses confirmed influence. Through reassurance, frustration, or explanation, she could feel your attention oriented toward her. That access gave her a sense of relevance, even when things felt unstable. When that access disappeared, the dynamic shifted in a way that was subtle but undeniable. Without your reactions, there were no emotional hooks left to pull, no buttons to press. Silence removed the familiar mechanisms of influence, and with them, the sense of control she hadn't realized she held. What unsettled her wasn't distance, it was irrelevance. Epictetus taught that freedom begins when external things lose the power to disturb us. That freedom doesn't, it appears through restraint. Reacting, you didn't shut her out. You stopped handing over your inner state. And once emotions are no longer accessible, influence fades on its own. This is where many misunderstand. Losing access doesn't mean losing awareness or humanity. You still felt, you still noticed absence, but your feelings no longer dictated your direction. Your internal compass stopped responding to external movement. And when someone realizes they no longer shape your emotional landscape, the shift feels disorienting. There was nothing to negotiate, no conversation to reopen the door. Your self-governance removed the familiar entry points. You weren't withdrawing to protect ego. You were standing in alignment with yourself. And alignment doesn't bend easily. When she lost access to your emotions, access to your future trajectory, you didn't assert authority, you embodied it. And for someone who once felt central, that realization lingers not as rejection, but as displacement. Number 7. Indifference turned into curiosity. At first, your absence barely registered. It didn't feel important enough to examine. Life moved forward, routines filled the space, and whatever had ended seemed settled. Indifference felt natural in those early moments, not because you lacked significance, but because the mind often delays engagement with what doesn't immediately demand attention. When nothing hurts right away, the assumption is that nothing matters. Then something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly. She noticed that you weren't appearing where you once did, not reaching out, not reacting, not orbiting the familiar emotional paths she expected. That noticing wasn't emotional yet, it was cognitive. A quiet awareness that something had changed without announcement. And awareness, once formed, rarely stays neutral for long. Curiosity grows from contrast. When something that was once predictable becomes unreadable, the mind begins to circle it. Questions form quietly. Why didn't he say anything? What is he doing now? Did I misjudge how attached? These questions weren't urgent, but they were persistent. And persistence is what transforms indifference into focus that once felt irrelevant became noticeable. And then, mentally thinkers understood that unresolved questions linger longer than answered ones. Closure satisfies the mind temporarily, but uncertainty keeps it engaged. By leaving without explanation, you didn't provoke confusion. You created openness, by your intentions, or justify your silence. And in doing so, you became an unfinished thought. Unfinished thoughts don't fade easily. They return during quiet moments, when distraction weakens and reflection slips in, uninvited. What made this curiosity different was that it couldn't be resolved externally. There was no message to reread, no argument to revisit, no final conversation to reinterpret. Your silence offered no narrative to lean on. So the mind turned inward, replaying fragments, reevaluating moments, searching for meaning that was never explicitly given. Curiosity fed itself because there was nothing to close the loop. This is the quiet power of non-explanation. It doesn't demand attention, it earns it over time. By not defining the ending, you allowed the mind to do what it naturally does with ambiguity, revisit it, and each return deepened the impression you left behind. Indifference fades quickly when curiosity takes its place. Because curiosity isn't emotional noise, it's mental gravity. And once someone begins to wonder about what they no longer have access to, the absence stops being empty. It becomes active, persistent, alive in thought. Number 8. You didn't stop moving forward. What unsettled her most wasn't that you disappeared, it was that you continued. You didn't pause your life to process the loss publicly. You didn't announce heartbreak or signal transformation through visible displays. There were no dramatic resets, no declarations of growth, no effort to prove you were doing better. You simply kept going, quietly, steadily, and that consistency, without performance, created an uncertainty she hadn't anticipated. Most people expect absence to look a certain way: stagnation, visible struggle, or at least some sign the separation left a mark. When those signals don't appear, the mind searches for explanation. Your forward motion didn't signal loss or triumph. It suggested independence. And independence is unsettling when someone assumed your momentum depended on their presence. You didn't make your progress legible. From the outside, it wasn't clear what you were building or where you were headed. That ambiguity mattered. Growth that announces itself invites interpretation. Growth kept private forces speculation. She couldn't place you into familiar categories: hurt, bitter, waiting, or moved on. You existed outside the emotional scripts she expected. Stoic tradition values progress without performance. Cleanthes labored by day and studied by night, advancing without recognition. His discipline wasn't meant to be seen. It was meant to be lived. In the same way, your movement forward wasn't a statement. It was alignment. What made this difficult was the absence of emotional feedback. No collapse to confirm importance. No celebration to confirm replacement. Just continuity. Life unfolding without interruption. That continuity quietly revealed something she hadn't considered, that your direction was always in. Move forward to be noticed. And that's why it was. Progress without announcement carries a powerful signal. Your life was never on hold. And here's the shift that leads into what comes next. When someone realizes your life didn't stall, they're forced to face a quiet truth. Your center was never them. It was you. That's where the uncertainty deepens. Because they can't predict you, label you, or pull you back into an old story. Take a moment to reflect. Have you ever experienced someone reacting more to your calm progress than to your absence itself? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think progress without announcement communicates the loudest? Let's keep watching. Number 9. The dynamic shifted naturally. What ultimately altered the dynamic wasn't a calculated move or a deliberate attempt to influence the outcome. You didn't apply pressure. You didn't withdraw to provoke reaction or adjust your behavior to create longing. The shift happened quietly, and it happened because something within you changed first. Internal alignment replaced emotional reactivity, and the external relationship simply followed that new order. This is where many misunderstand what real detachment looks like. Detachment isn't a tactic designed to get someone back or to regain control. It's a reorientation of energy. Your focus moved inward. Attention returned to what you could govern: your actions, your standards, your rhythm of life. And as that internal structure stabilized, the emotional exchange that once defined the connection lost its centrality. You didn't remove yourself from the dynamic. The dynamic reorganized. Stoic thinkers believe that harmony in the outer world reflects order within. When inner life becomes disciplined, focused, the external without force. You didn't need to announce change or set conditions. Your calm altered the tone naturally. The absence of emotional fluctuation removed friction. And without friction, old patterns couldn't sustain themselves. From her perspective, the shift felt subtle but undeniable. The familiar push and pull was gone. The emotional feedback loop no longer operated. What remained was a quiet distance that didn't feel hostile, but it didn't feel accessible either. That neutrality was unfamiliar because it wasn't driven by mood or reaction. It was consistent, and consistency rooted in self-command carries a different weight than consistency rooted in attachment. What made this shift difficult to reverse was that it wasn't dependent on her behavior. She couldn't influence it by leaning in or pulling away because the center of gravity had moved. Your steadiness didn't respond to external variation. That independence redefined the relationship without requiring conversation. Natural shifts endure longer than forced ones because they aren't built on emotion, they're built on alignment. You didn't become distant, you became centered, and once that center held, every adjusted accordingly. Number 10. Your value didn't disappear. For a time, she believed your worth was tied to her decision. It was when she leaned in and diminished when she stepped away. Her attention felt like the lens through which your value was measured, not because she intended to define you, but because the dynamic had quietly trained both of you to see it that way. When connection existed, your presence felt meaningful. When it ended, she assumed that meaning would fade with it. But value doesn't vanish when recognition is removed. It only becomes harder to see for those who relied on proximity to measure it. What surprised her wasn't that you stayed composed, it was that nothing essential about you collapsed. You didn't scramble to reclaim validation. You didn't seek substitutes to fill the gap loudly. You remained steady in a way that contradicted the assumption that your worth had been on loan. Seneca wrote that loss reveals whether value was borrowed or built. Borrowed value depends on external approval to exist. Built value remains intact when approval is withdrawn. By continuing forward without her recognition, you demonstrated something that could only be understood in hindsight, that your foundation was internal. And internal foundations don't shake when one pillar is removed. This realization doesn't arrive immediately. At first, absence can feel like erasure. Without interaction, it's easy to assume importance has diminished, but as time passes, the opposite becomes clear. Your steadiness reframed the story. If your value had depended on her attention, its absence would have destabilized you. Instead, it clarified you. The lack of reaction wasn't emptiness, it was proof. What unsettled her was recognizing that your worth didn't require her to confirm it. That recognition often arrives late, because it contradicts a comforting belief that choosing to walk away determines what remains behind. When you didn't diminish that belief, this isn't about superiority or indifference. It's you didn't need to be seen to remain whole. You didn't need valid mind. And once that became evident, the dynamic shifted again, not emotionally, but intellectually. She could no longer frame the separation as a removal of value. It was simply a removal of access. And access, once gone, changes how value is perceived, because what can no longer be reached is often re-examined more honestly than what was always within arm's length. Number 11. Regret came quietly. Regret didn't arrive in a message, no emotional confession, no moment where everything spilled out at once. It didn't announce itself because regret rare. Instead, it set almost imperceptibly, like weight added a little at a time. It appeared in pauses, in still moments, in the spaces where distraction no longer worked the way it used to. What made it powerful wasn't intensity, it was persistence. At first, there were explanations that softened the edges, justifications that made the past feel reasonable. The mind is skilled at protecting itself early on, especially when silence creates room for reinterpretation. But over time, those explanations lost their sharpness. Without your presence to absorb emotional noise or redirect attention outward, there was nothing to interrupt reflection. And reflection, once uninterrupted, tends to deepen. This is where regret grows, not from loss alone, but from clarity. She began to see moments more accurately, not as isolated events, but as part of a larger pattern. Your restraint, your steadiness, the way you stepped back without damaging anything. The absence of anger or pursuit removed the comfort of conflict. There was no argument to hide behind, no reaction to blame, just a clean ending that left her alone with what had been overlooked. Stoic philosophy recognizes that regret thrives when distraction fades. Noise delays awareness. Silence accelerates it. Your absence removed the familiar background hum that once softened tension. Without constant interaction, emotional weight had nowhere to go but inward. And inward is where regret does its quiet work, rearranging memory, reframing significance, and slowly sharpening understanding. What made this regret different was that it couldn't be acted on easily. There was no obvious repair to make, no open door to knock on without consequence. Your dignity had closed the chapter without hostility, but also without invitation. That finality didn't feel punishing, it felt irreversible, and irreversibility is what gives regret its depth. This wasn't about wanting you back in a dramatic sense. It was about recognizing what without fully realizing it at the time. The weight came not from what happened, the effort that was assumed, the present relied on. It became visible after access was gone. Regret doesn't need noise to survive. It needs quiet. And in your absence created, it had all the space it needed to grow unnoticed at first, undeniable in the end. Before we move on, take a moment to sit with what this truly reveals. Regret grows in silence because silence removes every excuse, every distraction, every place to hide from the truth. When the noise fades, clarity steps forward, often uninvited, always undeniable. And in that clarity, she's left facing the weight of what was lost, not through drama, but through recognition. If this resonated with you, pause and reflect on how silence has shaped your own experiences and what it continues to teach you. Number 12. She finally saw you clearly. In the end, clarity didn't arrive through conversation or confrontation. It arrived through contrast. When all the noise faded, no explanations, no emotional negotiation, no attempts to be understood, what remained was you as you actually were. Not the version shaped by reaction or effort, but the man who stayed intact, even when unseen. And that distinction mattered more than anything you could have said. For a long time, she may have known you only through function, the man who showed up, the man who responded, the man who tried to hold things together, smooth tension, or make sense of emotional distance. That version of you was real, but incomplete. It was shaped by proximity and expectation. Only after detachment did a clearer image emerge, one not defined by effort, but by structure. What she finally saw was wholeness without audience. You didn't perform growth. You didn't demand recognition. You didn't attempt to rewrite the past in your favor. You simply remained aligned. Your life moved forward without needing to be witnessed, and that revealed something difficult to ignore, that your identity had never depended on being validated in real time. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that character is revealed when no one is watching, not when praise is available, not when explanation might shift perception, but when restraint is chosen privately and discipline is maintained without reward. Your detachment didn't create a new version of you. It stripped away everything that had been obscuring the original. This is why the realization came late. As long as you were present, your consistency could be taken for granted. As long as you were engaging, your strength blended into expectation. Only in absence did the outline sharpen. She could no longer confuse effort with dependence or calm with compliance. What remained was a man governed from within. Seeing you clearly didn't necessarily mean reaching out. Clarity doesn't always lead to action. Sometimes it leads to understanding that arrives too late to change the outcome. But understanding still matters, because it reframes the past honestly. It replaces assumption with recognition. Detachment didn't punish her. It didn't manipulate her perception. It allowed truth to surface without interference. And the truth was simple, even if it took time to see. You were never defined by how hard you tried to be understood. You were defined by how complete you remained when you no longer needed to be. She didn't lose you in a loud moment, she lost you in the quiet, when you stopped feeding the old pattern and chose self-command instead. And that's the part most people never expect. Detachment doesn't win a breakup. It simply reveals what was real all along: your discipline, your dignity, and the fact that your value was never on loan to anyone's attention. If this video hit where you're living right now, let it be a reminder. You don't have to explain your worth to be respected, and you don't have to chase to be remembered. Keep moving forward with calm standards, and let time do what noise never can. Now, if this message resonated, hit like, leave a comment, tell me which part described your situation the most, and watch the recommended videos on screen next, because they'll take this mindset even deeper. They say letting someone walk away is a choice, but what they don't talk about is what happens after. When a woman lets a man go, she often thinks she's in control of the story, but sometimes that story shifts in ways she never expected, especially when the man she let go doesn't return. In this video, we're going to break down what really unfolds after she lets you walk away, how silence begins to carry weight, how growth happens quietly, and how a man rooted in Stoic presence can shift the emotional dynamic without saying a single word. If this speaks to where you are right now, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me, because what comes next is where the story truly changes. Number 1. Silence didn't mean weakness. When you stopped reaching out, she didn't immediately register it as strength or intention, because from the outside, silence often looks like surrender. To her, it may have seemed as if you simply ran out of words, energy, or emotional leverage, as though you reached a point where you no longer knew what to say or how to respond. That interpretation is common, especially in dynamics where communication has always been used to restore balance, smooth tension, or keep emotional control alive. What she didn't see, however, was that your silence wasn't born from confusion or defeat, but from clarity. There comes a moment when a man realizes that continuing to speak does not bring understanding, and continuing to explain only turns his value into something that must be negotiated. When every conversation feels like justification rather than connection, restraint stops being passive and becomes intentional. Silence, in that moment, is no longer avoidance. It is alignment with self-respect. A Stoic man does not argue his worth or demand recognition when it is no longer freely given. He understands that value does not need to be defended through emotion or repetition. Instead, he chooses to remove his presence from spaces where it is not respected, not as an act of punishment, but as an act of self-governance. His silence is not meant to provoke a reaction. It is meant to restore internal order. What unsettled her was not the absence of messages, but the stability behind that absence. She expected a familiar pattern, where distance would eventually be followed by reassurance, explanation, or emotional effort. But as time passed, and your silence remained steady, it stopped feeling temporary and began to feel deliberate. The quiet held its shape, and that forced a shift in perception. Instead of wondering when you would reach out, she began wondering how you could remain grounded without doing so. Silence backed by inner control carries weight because it suggests direction rather than emotional collapse. It signals that you are no longer reacting, no longer seeking validation through communication, and no longer centering your peace around another person's response. Stoicism teaches that a man's power lies not in controlling outcomes, but in controlling what he offers to the world. You did not stop speaking to prove a point or create distance as a tactic. You stopped because your self-respect no longer allowed you to overextend yourself in a dynamic that required constant explanation. That silence was not weakness. It was the moment you chose composure over chaos and clarity over emotional noise. Number 2. The absence created a mirror. When you were no longer present, The change wasn't dramatic or immediate, but it was unmistakable. Her world didn't collapse, and it didn't suddenly become lonely in the way people often imagine after separation. Yet something fundamental shifted beneath the surface. The noise changed. The constant emotional exchange that once absorbed tension, redirected frustration, or softened uncertainty was gone, and in its place appeared a quieter environment that felt unfamiliar rather than calming. For a long time, your presence may have served as a kind of emotional buffer, even if neither of you named it that way. You listened when things felt heavy. You responded when emotions spilled over. You helped regulate moments that might otherwise have felt overwhelming or unresolved. Without realizing it, you became the place where emotional weight was released, processed, and then forgotten. When you stepped away, that release valve disappeared. What remained was not peace, but exposure. Silence has a way of stripping away distractions. Without your reactions, your reassurance, or your willingness to engage, her emotional patterns had nowhere to land but back onto herself. There was no immediate external response to soften, no familiar dynamic to redirect internal to quiet, reflective rather than soothing, forcing her to sit with feelings that previously moved outward instead of inward. This is where the mirror appeared. Not held up intentionally, and not one designed to accuse or correct, but one created naturally by absence. Without someone else to absorb emotional intensity, patterns become visible. Reactions repeat themselves more clearly. Choices feel heavier when they can no longer be shared or justified through interaction. In that stillness, self-awareness begins to form, even if it arrives slowly and without conscious intention. You didn't need to explain your perspective or revisit old conversations for this to happen. In fact, explanation would have softened the impact. Words tend to offer escape routes, ways to reframe or rationalize behavior before it's fully felt. Silence removes those exits. It allows cause and effect to connect without interruption. Stoic philosophy recognizes this dynamic deeply. Growth is rarely sparked by argument. It is sparked by clarity. When external noise is removed, the mind begins to confront itself more honestly. By stepping away calmly rather than emotionally, you allowed reality to speak without distortion. Over time, that reflection changes how someone sees both themselves and the dynamic they were part of. The absence doesn't accuse, but it does reveal. And once a person begins to see their own patterns clearly, they can no longer pretend the reflection came from anywhere else. You didn't force understanding. You created the space, which could no longer be avoided. Her absence of your presence didn't just create quiet, it created a mirror she couldn't turn away from. Without your reactions, support, or emotional buffer, her patterns had nowhere to go but back to her. And that kind of stillness reveals truths conversation usually hides. This is where Stoic distance becomes powerful not as punishment, but as space where reality speaks for itself. Take a moment to reflect on this in your own situation. If this resonates with you, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, or simply type "My silence carries clarity" to remind yourself that your silence also carries clarity. Number 3. Her certainty began to crack. For a long time, her sense of certainty rested on something that felt stable and familiar to her, even if she never consciously acknowledged it. She believed that no matter how things unfolded, you would eventually return, reach out, or re-enter the emotional space between you in some form. That belief wasn't necessarily rooted in arrogance or manipulation, but in repetition. Patterns, once reinforced enough times, begin to feel permanent, and in her experience, distance had always been temporary because your presence had always followed. When you didn't come back this time, the first reaction wasn't panic, but disbelief. She assumed it was a phase, a pause, or a moment of pride that would soften with time. Silence, after all, 4. But as days passed and your absence remained steady, something subtle began to shift. The certainty she relied on no longer felt automatic. The expectation of your return stopped feeling guaranteed. What made this moment unsettling was not emotional coldness, but composure. Your silence didn't feel reactive or defensive, which would have made it easier to interpret as anger or wounded pride. Instead, it carried a sense of calm that suggested decision rather than emotion. And calm is far more destabilizing than drama, because it implies clarity without the need for negotiation. Stoicism teaches that control is an illusion, especially when it is built on another person's predictability. When someone believes they understand how you will respond, they begin to feel secure, not in connection, but in outcome. That kind of certainty is fragile, because it depends entirely on repetition rather than mutual presence. The moment repetition stops, the illusion collapses. As her expectation of your return weakened, so did the emotional structure built around it. Questions began to replace assumptions. Not loud questions, but quiet ones that surfaced when distractions faded. She wondered whether you had finally chosen something else, or someone else, or perhaps chosen yourself in a way that no longer required her involvement. The lack of confirmation made those thoughts linger longer than she expected. What unsettled her most was the realization that her sense of security had never been internal. It had been borrowed from your consistency. When that consistency transformed into quiet restraint, it exposed how much of her certainty was tied to control rather than connection. You didn't announce a boundary or explain a shift. You simply held your position. And in doing so, you demonstrated a Stoic principle few people are prepared to confront. When a man stops being predictable, he stops being controllable. That loss of control doesn't just change dynamics. It changes how certainty itself is experienced. Her confidence didn't vanish all at once. It fractured slowly. Answered expectation weakened the story she once told herself. On that crack, something new entered: uncertainty, not about you, she knew. Number 4. She expected you to. In the past, distance followed a familiar rhythm between you. Tension would rise, and emotional space would open, but it never lasted. Eventually, you stepped in. You asked questions, smoothed things over, or made the effort needed to restore balance. Over time, that pattern became predictable, and predictability quietly turned into expectation. Because of that history, distance stopped feeling dangerous. It felt temporary, like a phase in a cycle that always resolved the same way. No matter how far things drifted, there was a pursuit would follow. Not because it was demanded, but because it had always arrived. Grows used to being pursued, they stop seeing it as a choice and start seeing it as part of the relationship's structure. This time, that structure broke. You didn't rush to fix the silence or re-establish closeness. You didn't seek reassurance or try to bridge the gap through effort. You allowed the space to exist, even as it became uncomfortable. That wasn't passivity, it was restraint. And restraint, from one comes from fear, the other comes from self-respect. By not chasing, moved the emotional counterweight that once kept the dynamic stable. Restoring equilibrium every time tension appeared. Without that familiar response, stopped feeling safe. It no longer came with a guaranteed resolution, and that uncertainty changed how separation itself was experienced. Stoic philosophy teaches dignity over impulse. A grounded man does not move from fear of loss or the need to reclaim emotion. He understands that connection, sustained by pursuit alone, eventually erodes respect, not because effort is wrong, but because expected effort loses meaning. Your step back didn't communicate indifference. It communicated boundaries. You showed that your presence isn't automatic, and that reconnection requires mutual willingness. What changed everything wasn't the silence itself, but the intention behind it. She didn't feel the loss because you stopped caring. She felt it because you stopped chasing. Number 5. Emotional gravity shifted. For a long time, the emotional center of the dynamic revolved around her attention and her sense of closeness or distance. Without realizing it, she may have been oriented toward maintaining that orbit, adjusted or distant she felt at any given moment. When her attention was present, things felt stable. When it faded, movement followed. That pattern created a quiet imbalance, where emotional momentum flowed in one direction more than the other. The shift began the moment you stopped moving toward her attention, as if it were the axis everything depended on. You didn't announce a change or demand recognition for it. You simply withdrew your emotional investment from the cycle of reaction. And when that happened, the entire structure of the dynamic began to reorganize itself. Emotional gravity doesn't come from intensity or effort. It comes from stillness. When someone is no longer trying to pull connection toward themselves, they begin to feel grounded in a way that others notice instinctively. Your calm presence, no longer seeking reassurance or engagement, created contrast. The absence of pursuit made the distance visible in a new way, because now she was the one becoming aware of it. At first, the shift was subtle. She may not have consciously registered what was happening, but something felt off. The familiar sense of being the emotional reference point was gone. Without you adjusting your orbit around her attention, the space between you began to feel different. It no longer felt like a gap waiting to be closed, but like a distance that required effort from her side to bridge. This is where emotional gravity changes direction. When one person stops chasing connection, the other begins to feel the absence more acutely, not because of manipulation, but because balance has been restored. Attention, once expected, becomes noticeable by its absence, and calm, when it replaces emotional movement, becomes magnetic. Stoic thinkers understood this long before modern psychology gave it language. True power is not exerted through control, persuasion, or emotional force. It emerges from composure and self-mastery. A man who is centered does not pull others toward him. He allows them to notice where he stands. That steadiness creates attraction, without effort, because it signals inner order. You didn't try to reverse roles or provoke longing. You simply reclaimed your emotional center. By doing so, orbiting someone else's attention. And once that happened, the emotional weight shifted naturally. She didn't suddenly miss you because she felt the shift because you stopped moving. Before moving forward, take a moment to sit with what just shifted here. When you stopped orienting yourself around her attention, the dynamic changed without effort or explanation. Stillness replaced pursuit, and balance quietly returned. This is the kind of change that doesn't announce itself, but it's always felt. Reflect on whether you've experienced this shift in your own life, and if it resonates, share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes clarity deepens the moment we put it into words. Number 6. She watched, quietly. When there was still no call and no message, it might have looked from the outside as though nothing was happening at all, as though the connection had simply faded into irrelevance. But silence does not erase awareness. It sharpens it. The absence of direct contact did not remove you from her attention. It merely changed the way that attention was exchanging out. She observed. Instead of speaking, curiosity is rarely loud at first. It doesn't announce its messageable confessions. It begins internally, in moments when the mind is unguarded. Answers quietly replaces certainty. She went through life without her presence, whether your days felt lighter or heavier, and whether it's from a distant thing real rather than temporary restraint. Without intending to, you became a question rather than a certainty. She checked your story, crude, but to orient herself. She noticed what you shared, how you carried yourself, and what you didn't say just as much as what you did. Each glimpse offered information without commitment, allowing her to observe without exposing vulnerability. Watching from a distance felt safer than reaching out because it preserved control while satisfying curiosity. What drew her attention was not visibility, but dignity. You didn't vanish in anger or broadcast emotional withdrawal. You didn't post in ways designed to provoke reaction or signal loss. Your absence felt composed rather than reactive, and that composure invited interpretation. Silence paired with stability creates intrigue because it suggests that something has changed internally, not just externally. Stoic philosophy emphasizes restraint over display. A Stoic man does not announce growth or demand to be seen differently. He allows his actions, or sometimes his lack of action, to speak in their own time. By choosing quiet over explanation, you left space for curiosity to form naturally. And curiosity, once it appears, has a way of deepening on its own. As days passed, watching became habitual and incidental. She noticed patterns, consistency, and the absence of emotional volatility. That steadiness contradicted the story she once told herself about your emotional availability. Each quiet observation weakened old assumptions and replaced them with unanswered questions. You didn't ask for her attention. You didn't seek validation. You simply moved forward without spectacle. And that quiet dignity gave her something to look at, something to wonder about, and something she could no longer easily define. Number 7. Your calm triggered reflection. There is a particular kind of discomfort that arises when someone expects emotional reaction and instead encounters composure. Not indifference, not coldness, but a steady calm that doesn't flinch or rush to respond. When you didn't react the way she anticipated, it created a contrast she couldn't ignore. Your restraint didn't provoke drama, but it quietly highlighted something else. The emotional turbulence she had grown used to, releasing outward now, had nowhere to go. Calm has a way of exposing chaos without saying a word. When one person remains grounded, the imbalance becomes visible, especially to the one who is no longer met with familiar emotional engagement. She may not have immediately labeled it as reflection, but internally, something began to shift. Your composure acted like a still surface, one that reflected her own restlessness back to her more clearly than any conversation ever could. In the past, emotional reactions may have blurred responsibility. Tension could be shared, redirected, or softened through interaction, but without your responses to absorb or counterbalance emotional waves, she was left alone with them. That solitude wasn't peaceful at first. It brought awareness, and awareness, when it arrives unexpectedly, often feels uncomfortable before it becomes honest. What unsettled her most was not that you seemed unaffected, but that you appeared centered. Your calm didn't feel forced or performative. It felt earned. That distinction matters, because calm that is real cannot be argued with or dismissed. It suggests internal order rather than emotional suppression, and it quietly invites comparison. It's the difference between reacting and responding, between emotional momentum and emotional mastery. This is where regret often begins, not as longing, but as recognition. Recognition that something stable was present and no longer accessible in the same way. Recognition that your steadiness was not accidental, but chosen. And recognition that her own emotional state felt louder in contrast to your quiet control. Stoic philosophy at influencing others through manipulation or pressure. Its focus was always in becoming unshakable, regardless of circumstance. By choosing calm over reaction, you embodied that principle without announcing it. You didn't try to teach a lesson or create impact. You simply became harder to disturb. And when someone encounters that kind of presence, after being accustomed to emotional accessibility, it creates space for reflection, not because you demanded it, but because your calm made everything else feel louder. In that contrast, old assumptions weaken and new understanding begins to take shape. You didn't confront her with words. You confronted her with who you became. If this contrast between her chaos and your calm is starting to make more sense to you, take a moment to sit with it. This is the quiet point, where a lot of men either break their composure or really understand its power. Before we move on to what happens next in her mind, I'd love to hear your perspective. So if this resonates, tap like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Or simply type "calm beats chaos" to remind yourself that your peace is not negotiable. Number 8. The narrative she held broke down. For a long time, she carried a story about who you were and how you functioned within her life. And that story felt reliable because it had been reinforced by experience. In that narrative, you were emotionally available in predictable ways, responsive when distance appeared, and willing to re-enter the connection whenever uncertainty surfaced. It wasn't a malicious story, but it was a limiting one, shaped by patterns rather than depth. Over time, that version of you became the lens through which she interpreted every silence, every return, and every emotional exchange. Stories like that create comfort because they simplify complexity. When someone believes they understand how another person will react, they feel secure, not necessarily in the relationship itself, but in their ability to predict outcomes. In her mind, emotional dependence was not something she named outright, but something she felt through consistency. You would respond, you would return, you would re-engage. That predictability became the foundation of her narrative. What disrupted every temptation, but refusal to perform. When you didn't follow the appearance, silence, when it contradicted expectation, created confusion rather than clarity. She waited for familiar signals that never arrived. And without those cues, the narrative she relied on ran of you she thought she understood, not the man. You didn't correct her assumptions or offer a new explanation to replace the old one, and that absence of explanation mattered. Words would have allowed the story to adapt, to reshape itself around justification or emotional framing. Silence left it exposed. Without reinforcement, the narrative weakened, and without interaction to sustain it, it began to collapse under its own weight. Stoic philosophy emphasizes the danger of living inside stories that are not grounded in reality. When perception becomes detached from truth, illusion fills the gap. By removing yourself from the dynamic without drama or defense, you allowed reality to stand on its own. You didn't argue against the version of you she believed in. You simply stopped feeding it. As the story broke down, something uncomfortable followed. She had to confront the possibility that her understanding of you was incomplete, and that her sense of control was built on a version of you that no longer existed. That realization is destabilizing, because it forces a re-evaluation not just of you, but of the assumptions she made about the dynamic itself. You didn't try to redefine yourself in her eyes. You didn't ask to be seen differently. You let the old image burn away in silence. And in that quiet absence, the truth began to surface on its own. Number 9. Regret arrived, but she hid it. Regret rarely enters loudly, and it almost never shows up in the way people expect. It doesn't announce itself with apologies or dramatic admissions, especially when pride is still intact. More often, it arrives quietly, settling beneath the surface where it can be hidden behind composure, distraction, or silence. From the outside, it may have looked like nothing had changed, but internally, something began to press against her certainty in ways she couldn't easily ignore. At first, regret didn't feel like longing. It felt like unease, a subtle awareness that the story was moving forward without her involvement, and that she was no longer positioned at the center of it. She told herself that distance was normal, that time would clarify things, and that whatever you were doing would eventually circle back. But that reassurance didn't hold the way it once did, because this time, your absence wasn't stagnant. It was directional. What unsettled her was not simply that you were gone, but that you weren't frozen in place, waiting to be acknowledged. She began to sense movement where she expected pause, growth where she expected emotional suspension. Your life appeared to be unfolding without reference to her presence, and that realization created a quiet fracture. Regret grows fastest when someone recognizes that their relevance is no longer assumed. She didn't express this openly, because regret threatens identity. Admitting it would require acknowledging misjudgment, and that kind of vulnerability often feels too costly at first. So it stayed hidden, masked by neutrality or outward calm. But internally, questions accumulated. She wondered whether she had mistaken your patience for permanence, or your availability for dependence. And those questions didn't resolve themselves easily. Stoic philosophy teaches that attachment to outcome creates fear, especially when control begins to slip. Her fear didn't come from losing you emotionally, but from realizing that she no longer influenced the direction of your growth. You were evolving without her involvement, and that evolution made her absence feel permanent rather than temporary. Regret deepens when someone realizes that what they once believed to be secure was never guaranteed. Your continued progress, unaccompanied by bitterness or display, made that truth unavoidable. She didn't fear your silence. She feared what your silence represented: independence, momentum, and a future that no longer revolved around her validation. She hid the regret because naming it would require action, and action would require admitting that something valuable had already moved beyond her reach. Number 10. She realized you were changing without her. The realization did not arrive all at once, and it certainly did not come from anything you said or displayed deliberately. It emerged gradually, through observation rather than confirmation, as she began to sense that your life was moving in a direction that no longer intersected with hers. You weren't frozen in emotional limbo, waiting for clarity or reconciliation. You were active, focused, and quietly building something that did not depend on her presence. What made this realization difficult for her to process was the absence of performance. You didn't announce words, nor did you signal transformation with dramatic gestures meant to be seen or interpreted. There were no cryptic quotes, no emotional broadcasts, and no attempts to frame yourself as someone who had moved on. Instead, change revealed itself indirectly, through consistency, tone, and the way you carried yourself. Growth, when it is real, doesn't ask to be acknowledged. Your presence felt different because it was rooted elsewhere. Attention that once flowed outward now returned inward. Focus replaced reaction. Steadiness replaced emotional fluctuation. Even from a distance, that shift was perceptible because it altered the energy surrounding you. She could feel that you were no longer orienting your life around connection, validation, or outcome. And that realization unsettled her more than absence ever could. Stoic philosophy emphasizes the idea that character is revealed through action rather than declaration. A Stoic man does not seek to convince others of his evolution. He lives in alignment with it. By choosing discipline over display and composure over expression, you allowed growth to unfold without interruption. That kind of development is difficult to dismiss because it isn't dependent on approval. What troubled her most was the understanding that your change had occurred without her involvement. She was no longer a reference point in your decisions, nor a catalyst for your momentum. That awareness introduced a new form of distance, one that could not be closed by communication alone. The man she observed was no longer defined by emotional availability or responsiveness. Change that happens quietly. It signals inner trust, qualities that cannot be negotiated or reclaimed once established. She realized that whatever version of you she once knew no longer existed in the same way, and that the new version had emerged independently. You didn't rise through resistance or declaration. You rose through discipline, restraint, and focus. And that is how a Stoic man ascends, not loudly, not visibly, but with a presence that speaks for itself. Before we move forward, pause for a moment and sit with what this really means. Quiet change doesn't just alter direction, it alters perception. When growth happens without explanation or display, it forces reflection in everyone who witnesses it, especially those who once felt central to your life. Take a second to reflect on where your own focus has shifted and what kind of presence you're cultivating now. If this resonates, leave a comment sharing what stood out to you, or simply type, "I choose direction over reaction" to mark that shift for yourself. Number 11. The door feels heavier now. There was a time when reaching out to you felt simple, almost automatic, as though connection required no real exposure or emotional risk. Messages could be sent casually. Silence could be broken without consequence. And contact itself carried little weight because it had always been available. Access felt assumed rather than earned. But that sense of ease belonged to a version of the dynamic that no longer exists. Now, the door feels heavier. What changed was not your availability, but the meaning attached to it. Your silence introduced gravity where there once was convenience. Reaching out no longer feels neutral, because neutrality depends on predictability. And predictability disappeared the moment you stopped standing still. When a man no longer orients himself around being accessible, every attempt to reconnect carries implication. Contact becomes a statement rather than a habit. She feels that weight internally, even if she never articulates it. Reaching out would mean acknowledging distance, admitting uncertainty, and risking rejection in a way she never had to before. Silence, once something she could lean on, now stands between intention and action. And silence backed by growth is not empty. It is charged with meaning. This is where value becomes clear. Value does not announce itself loudly, nor does it demand recognition. It accumulates through restraint, through discipline, and through the refusal to overextend. By choosing not to rush back into familiarity, you transformed access into something that must be considered rather than assumed. That shift alone alters how effort is perceived. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "What stands in the way becomes the way," not as a poetic observation, but as a principle of inner strength. Obstacles, when met with composure, become sources of growth rather than barriers. In your case, silence became the obstacle that reshaped everything. It forced reflection, clarified boundaries, and revealed direction. And now, that same silence stands as a threshold she cannot cross casually. The door feels heavier because you are no longer waiting behind it. You moved forward without resentment, without spectacle, and without leaving emotional debris behind. That kind of movement creates permanence. It signals that returning to the past version of the dynamic would require effort, vulnerability, and humility. She doesn't hesitate because she doesn't care. She hesitates because she does. And that hesitation exists because you stopped standing still, stopped making access effortless, and stopped offering yourself without weight. The door didn't close loudly. It simply became something that must be opened with intention. In the end, what truly changed wasn't her feelings, it was the structure of the dynamic itself. When you stopped explaining, stopped chasing, and stopped standing still, the story moved forward without noise. Silence gained weight. Growth gained direction. And your presence, no longer reactive or negotiable, became grounded in something deeper than emotion. This is the quiet power of choosing self-respect over reassurance, composure over chaos, not to provoke, not to punish, but to align with who you became when you finally stepped out of a pattern that no longer honored you. If this message resonated with where you are right now, take a moment to like the video. It helps more than you know. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or what stood out most to you. And when you're ready, watch the recommended videos on screen, because this journey doesn't end here. What comes next is where clarity deepens and where a Stoic man truly steps into his strength. They say when a woman returns, it's loud emotional texts, dramatic apologies, or sudden confessions. But the truth? It's almost never like that. Real comebacks begin quietly, subtly. Long before the message arrives, long before the call is made, there are signs, small shifts in her energy that most men never notice. In today's video, we'll uncover the early, often invisible signs that she's close to coming back. These moments only appear when you've done the hard thing, stayed silent, stayed grounded, and let your stoic presence speak louder than words. If you're ready to see what most miss, stay with me. And if this resonates, take a second to like the video, the channel, and let's get into it. Number 1. Her curiosity quietly returns. Before contact ever returns, something far more subtle takes shape beneath the surface. Curiosity. Not the dramatic kind that leads to impulsive messages or late-night calls, but the quiet, private, wondering she never talks about. She begins to think about you in moments when her mind is unguarded during idle time, while scrolling, while something reminds her of a version of life that once felt familiar. The certainty she once had about you starts to erode, and in its place, questions begin to form. She wonders what your days look like now, whether your life feels lighter or heavier without her presence, whether you're still emotionally available in the same way, or if something in you has shifted. These questions don't come with answers, and that's exactly why they linger. She doesn't ask you directly. Instead, she watches quietly. She may check your social presence without engaging. She may ask mutual connections, casual questions that sound harmless on the surface. Or she may simply sit with the thought of you longer than she expects, replaying fragments of who you were and comparing them to who you might be now. What's important here is that this curiosity isn't fueled by need, it's fueled by uncertainty. When you were predictable, curiosity had no reason to exist. Your reactions, your availability, your emotional position in her life were already known. But when you stopped explaining yourself, stopped clarifying where you stood, stopped offering emotional updates, you removed the map she used to navigate you. And without a map, the mind begins to explore. Stoic philosophy has long understood this dynamic. When a man stops trying to control how he's perceived, he unintentionally becomes more observed. Silence, when chosen rather than forced, creates space. And space invites attention. You didn't disappear in chaos or resentment. You didn't announce your withdrawal. You simply continued living with steadiness. That calm absence didn't erase you. It sharpened her awareness of you. Curiosity is the first crack in emotional closure. It doesn't mean regret yet. It doesn't mean longing or desire in its full form. It means the old mental file labeled, "I understand him," no longer feels accurate. And the mind dislikes unfinished understanding. So it revisits, it reconsiders, it asks quiet questions in the background. From a Stoic perspective, this is not something you provoke, it's something you allow. By refusing to chase reassurance or clarity, you let reality speak for itself. And reality, when left uninterrupted, often raises more questions than explanations ever could. Her curiosity isn't a signal to act. It's a sign that your silence has restored weight to your presence. And once curiosity returns, the emotional door she thought was closed is no longer fully shut. It's simply unattended. Pause for a moment and sit with what this really means. Curiosity doesn't announce itself loudly, but it changes everything quietly. When uncertainty replaces certainty, the dynamic has already shifted. Take a breath and reflect on whether you've felt this shift before, either in yourself or in someone else. If this resonates, leave a comment sharing what stood out to you, or simply type "Curiosity changes the balance" below. Your reflection matters, and it's often in these quiet realizations that the deeper understanding begins. Number 2. Small excuses to reopen contact. When contact finally reappears, it almost never arrives carrying emotion. There's no confession, no apology, no admission of missing you. Instead, it shows up dressed as something ordinary, almost forgettable. A simple question, a comment about something minor, a reason that, if examined closely, doesn't truly require reaching out at all. And that's intentional. She isn't ready to step into vulnerability yet. What she's doing instead is testing the emotional temperature. This first message is not about the subject it mentions. The topic is merely camouflage. What she's really asking is unspoken. Is it safe to approach you again? Are you still where I left you? Will the old dynamic snap back into place if I extend a hand? She chooses something casual because casual contact feels low risk. It allows her to engage without revealing intention, without exposing emotion, and without committing to anything beyond the moment itself. From the outside, this kind of message can look insignificant, easy to dismiss, easy to misinterpret, but psychologically, it's loaded. It means silence has done something explanations never could. It created uncertainty, and uncertainty disrupts emotional equilibrium. The Stoics understood that people act from imbalance long before they understand the cause of it. When inner stability shifts, behavior follows first. Insight comes later. That's why the excuse feels slightly off, slightly unnecessary, because the real motivation isn't logic, it's internal pressure. The mind wants resolution. It wants to know where it stands. And when curiosity and uncertainty have been left unanswered for long enough, the smallest opening becomes enough justification to act. What matters most here is how different this feels from past contact. Before, reaching out may have felt effortless, routine, predictable. Now, even a simple message carries weight. She's aware, consciously or not, that something has changed. You didn't chase. You didn't smooth things over. You didn't rush to restore comfort. And because of that, she no longer knows what response to expect. Stoic restraint plays a quiet but powerful role here. By not reacting impulsively, by not over-explaining or rushing to re-establish familiarity, you change the cost of contact. The door is no longer wide open, but it isn't slammed shut either. It simply requires intention to walk through, and intention feels risky when certainty is gone. This is why these small excuses appear before anything meaningful. They're reconnaissance, a way to gather emotional information without revealing personal stakes. It's not about restarting the relationship yet. It's about seeing whether the ground beneath her feet is stable, or if stepping forward will require vulnerability she's not ready to face. Number 3. Her emotional tone softens. Long before her words say anything meaningful, her tone tells the real story. The edge that once lived in her messages is gone. The defensiveness, the guarded phrasing, the subtle tension that made every interaction feel like a negotiation. What replaces it isn't enthusiasm or vulnerability yet. It's softness, a calmer rhythm, fewer sharp turns, a tone that feels more human than strategic. And this shift matters far more than whatever she actually says. Emotional tone is rarely conscious. People can choose their words, but tone leaks out from beneath intention. When someone feels tense or emotionally guarded, that tension shapes how they communicate, even when they try to hide it. When the tension fades, communication loosens naturally. Sentences breathe. Pauses feel less calculated. There's less urgency to protect position or control outcome. Seneca understood this well. He wrote that emotions reveal themselves through rhythm and tone, long before they reveal themselves through confession. Before someone admits how they feel, their emotional state has already begun, expressing itself indirectly. Softness is one of those expressions, and it only appears when the nervous system feels threatened. Earlier, her tone may have been clipped, distant, or overly way that felt artificial. That kind of emotional armor exists to prevent vulnerability, but armor is exhausting to maintain. When the disappears, no pressure, no chasing, no demand for clarity, it comes off on its own. Your silence played a key role here. Not silence as punishment or withdrawal, but silence as steadiness. You didn't pursue resolution. You didn't ask for reassurance. You didn't try to manage her emotions. And without resistance, emotional friction faded. From a Stoic perspective, this is the outcome of non-interference. When you stop trying to control another person's emotional state, you become a calm reference point instead of an emotional variable. Calm creates safety, not through reassurance, but through consistency. That safety shows up first in tone. Softness isn't confession, it's preparation. And when tone softens, it signals that the ground inside her is stabilizing, making closeness possible again through quiet emotional safety, not force. Number 4. Shared memories resurface. When shared memories begin to resurface, they rarely arrive announced. She doesn't say she misses you. She doesn't frame it as reflection or regret. Instead, it slips into conversation as something casual, an inside joke, a passing reference, a moment that once felt ordinary but now carries a subtle weight. On the surface, it sounds harmless, but emotionally, it's deliberate. This isn't nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It's a quiet attempt at reconnection. Memories are emotional shortcuts. They allow someone to return to a feeling without asking permission. When she brings up a shared moment, she isn't just recalling the past. She's testing whether the emotional bridge between you still exists. She's seeing if that version of closeness can be accessed again without risk. Because if the memory still lands, if it still feels warm or familiar, then the bond was never fully gone. It was simply dormant. What's important is the type of memory she chooses. It's rarely dramatic, not the big arguments or the painful endings. It's the small, human moments, the private humor, the routines, the shared experiences that existed when things felt effortless. Those memories represent emotional safety. They come from a time when connection didn't require, when being close felt natural. From a Stoic perspective, this is where restraint matters. A Stoic man does not cling to the past. He doesn't romanticize it or attempt to revive it through force. But he understands that the mind reaches backwards to feel forward again. The resurfacing of memories isn't about reliving what was. It's about assessing whether closeness is still possible now. By not chasing these moments or overreacting to them, you maintain emotional balance. You acknowledge the memory without anchoring yourself to it, and that restraint changes the dynamic. If you were to grasp at the past, you would signal need. If you were to dismiss it coldly, you would signal distance. But calm acknowledgement, neither clinging nor rejecting, signals strength and presence. Memories resurface when someone wants to feel close again without saying it. They are a form of emotional testing that feels safer than vulnerability. If she were to say she misses you outright, she would risk rejection or imbalance. But a memory, a joke, a shared reference, that feels low risk. It allows her to observe your response without exposing her heart. Stoic philosophy teaches that the past should inform, not control. You don't need to reopen old doors or reframe history. The fact that she's referencing it tells you enough. It means the emotional imprint remains. It means silence didn't erase connection. It clarified it. When shared memories return, it's not an accident. It's a sign that she's searching for emotional continuity. And while a Stoic man doesn't live in what was, he recognizes when the past is being used as a bridge one carefully extended, quietly, to see if closeness can exist again without words. As you sit with this, take a moment to notice what isn't being said by her and by you. Shared memories don't resurface to pull you backward. They appear to test whether you're grounded enough to stay present without losing balance. This is a quiet checkpoint, not a call to act. Reflect on how restraint feels in moments like this, how acknowledging without grasping preserves your center. If this resonates, leave a comment sharing what stood out to you, or simply type, "I remain grounded," to mark that you understand the difference between remembering and returning. Number 5. She tests your availability. When her behavior starts to feel inconsistent, it's easy to mistake it for confusion. One day she replies slowly, almost distant. The next, she's suddenly quick and engaged. She pulls back, then reappears without explanation. But these shifts aren't random. They're observational. She's watching how you respond to changes in access. In the past, your availability may have been predictable. When she leaned in, you followed. When she pulled away, you reacted. That responsiveness was feedback. It told her where she stood without her having to ask. And without it, she needs information, not through conversation, Changing her pace, she observes yours. By withdrawing briefly, she watches to see if you chase. By returning unexpectedly, she notices whether your energy shifts. This isn't a conscious test designed to manipulate. It's a natural response to uncertainty. Emotional certainty disappears. The mind looks for signs of control, places great value on consistency, not in constant availability, but in inner stability. When your tone, rhythm, and presence don't fluctuate based on her attention, something unfamiliar appears. Emotional steadiness. And you're not punishing. You're simply grounded. And grounded behavior when someone else is unsure. Most people adjust themselves in response to attention. They become more eager when engagement increases and more anxious when it fades. That adjustment reveals dependence. But when your pace remains the same, her tests produce no clear answer. And that lack of clarity creates tension, not conflict, but curiosity. Uncertainty has a magnetic quality. The mind is drawn to what it cannot easily predict. When she no longer knows whether her presence affects your center, she becomes more aware of you. Your calm stops feeling passive and starts feeling intentional. Not because you're doing less, but because you're no longer reacting. This is where attraction often begins to reform. Not through intensity or effort, but through contrast. Your steadiness becomes against her fluctuating engagement, and that contrast quietly shifts the dynamic. She senses that your presence exists independently of her actions. Stoic philosophy teaches self-governance. You don't let external behavior dictate your internal state. You don't speed up or slow down to match inconsistency. You remain centered, and when you do, her testing doesn't pull you off balance, it reveals that balance instead. Number 6. Her ego stops competing with your silence. In the beginning, your silence doesn't feel neutral to her. It feels like a challenge, not because you said anything, but because you didn't. Silence can bruise the ego when it interrupts expectation. When she was used to reaction, explanation, or emotional feedback, your absence of response created friction. It felt like something to push against, and the ego always wants to push back. At first, she may have framed the distance as a contest. Who will break first? Who will regain control? Who will reassert position? It became something to resist, something to outlast. This isn't about hostility. It's about pride. The ego interprets non-engagement as loss of influence, and it responds by truance through endurance. But resistance requires energy. It requires focus, and over time, without reinforcement, it weakens. Epictetus understood this deeply. He only survives through engagement. The moment there is no opponent, collapses under its own weight. Ego needs reaction to stay alive. It has nothing to feed on. Your silence didn't explain, and because of that, there was nothing for her pride to fight, no resistance to measure herself against. What initially felt like a standoff slowly turned into stillness, and stillness necessary the struggle was in the first place. This is the point where something important shifts. To win, not because she lost, but because winning no longer means anything. Acceptance here. The emotional energy that once fueled resistance starts to drain away its place. Something calmer takes root. From a Stoic perspective, this is not dominance, it's detachment. You didn't silence yourself to punish, or you simply refused to participate in an emotional contest that led nowhere. By doing nothing, you removed the battlefield. And when there is no battlefield, the fight cannot. When her ego stops competing with your silence, it's a sign. Pride has stepped aside. The need to maintain position has failed. Without that need, space opens for something more honest to return yet. But it's a necessary passage. When ego exists, clarity becomes possible. And clarity is what allows connection not from a place of power or pride, but from quiet acceptance. Number 7. Indirect personal questions shift. The change is subtle, but meaningful about her. She doesn't bring up the relationship or reopen old emotional ground. Her curiosity turns toward your life, your routines, your focus, your direction. On the surface, they're neutral, but emotionally, they signal something deeper. She is no longer through emotion alone. She's reassessing your value through structure, purpose, and trajectory. Earlier, the emotional dynamic may have defined how she perceived you, how available you were, how reactive, how invested. Now, with that emotional noise gone, something else comes into focus. Who you are when you're not trying to be chosen. Indirect questions feel safer than direct ones. Asking about your direction doesn't require vulnerability. It doesn't expose longing or uncertainty, but it allows her to gather information. She's trying to understand what anchors you now, whether your life feels grounded, whether you're building something that doesn't revolve around her. He has always emphasized this distinction. A man grounded in purpose doesn't persist. He doesn't explain his value, he lives it. Epictetus taught that it builds itself through action, not declaration. And when emotional engagement is removed, action becomes. That's why these questions matter. Than her internal focus. She's no longer asking, how do I feel? Asking, who is he becoming? That question carries weight. It suggests respect beginning to form independently of emotion. Notice also what she's not asking, probing for reassurance. She isn't seeking clarity about your intentions. She isn't trying to pull you back into emotional exchange. That restraint tells you she's observing rather than steering. Your role here is not to impress or perform. Stoic presence doesn't require elaboration. Sell your progress, defy your path. You simply speak calmly, honestly, and without urgency. That composure reinforces what the questions are already trying to discover, that your life has direction beyond reaction. Purpose has gravity. It draws attention without effort because it signals independence. When she senses that your focus isn't anchored to her approval, it changes the emotional balance. You are no longer something to manage or influence. You become something to understand. Indirect personal questions appear when attraction begins to shift from emotional familiarity to respect. And respect, once it takes root, creates a different kind of pull, one that doesn't rely on persuasion, but on presence. And this is where it's worth pausing. These shifts don't announce themselves loudly. They reveal themselves quietly, in tone, in curiosity, in what she chooses to notice. Take a moment to reflect on what you've experienced so far. If this resonates, tap like to support the channel, leave a comment, sharing your thoughts, or simply type a specific sentence below. Sometimes awareness is the real turning point, and the next insight builds directly from here. Number 8. Vulnerability slips through. When vulnerability begins to appear, it rarely announces itself. She doesn't sit you down for a deep emotional conversation. She doesn't frame what she shares as something important. Instead, it slips through casually. A brief mention of stress, a passing comment about feeling unsure, a quiet admission of doubt. The words sound light, almost incidental, but the emotion behind them is real. This kind of vulnerability is unguarded, strategic. It isn't designed to pull you closer in obvious ways. It emerges because something inside her has softened enough to allow it. Earlier, emotional walls existed for a reason. She didn't feel safe enough or steady enough to let uncertainty show. Now, that resistance is weakening. Stoicism is often misunderstood here. It's not emotional shutdown or detachment from feeling. It's emotional containment. the ability to experience emotion without letting it spill outward in ways that destabilize others. A Stoic man doesn't suppress emotion, he regulates it, and regulation creates space. When you demonstrate that you can hold your own emotional state without pressure, without urgency, signal safety, not safety, through reassurance, through steadiness. You're not overwhelmed by her vulnerability. You don't rush to fix it. You don't absorb it as responsibility. You remain present without being reactive. That presence matters. People share vulnerability where they feel it won't create imbalance. If someone senses that their uncertainty will be met with anxiety, control, or emotional dependence, they keep it hidden. But when they sense calm containment, they allow more truth to surface. Her vulnerability slipping through tells you something important. She's beginning to trust the emotional environment around you again, not the relationship, not the future, the space, trusting that her honesty won't trigger pressure or expectation. Notice how different this is from earlier stages. This isn't curiosity or testing. It isn't observation or indirect engagement. This is exposure small, but meaningful. She's letting you see parts of her internal state without demanding response. Your role is simple and disciplined. You listen. You acknowledge without amplifying. You don't interpret vulnerability as invitation to push forward. Stoic restraint teaches that not every opening requires movement. Sometimes, holding space is the movement. When vulnerability slips through, it's because emotional containment has been felt. She senses that you can carry yourself, and once someone carries yourself, they begin to trust you with what they're carrying too. Number 9. She notices your growth without you announcing it. Real growth rarely introduces itself. It doesn't arrive with explanations, updates, or declarations of change. You didn't tell her yourself. You didn't point out how different you've become. Not through words, but through absence, through where there used to be reaction, through steadiness, where there was once urgent of growing in a quiet way. It can't be easily challenged or dismissed because it isn't performative. There's no announcement to argue with, no story to question. The change is felt in how you respond, how you no longer rush to fill space. And because it isn't explained, it feels more real. Marcus Aurelius believed that character speaks loudest when unadvertised. In his view, virtue loses power when it seeks rest. The same applies here. When growth is loud, it feels defensive, as if it needs to be seen to be valid. When growth is quiet, it feels integrated, lived, permanent. She notices this through contrast. She remembers how you once reacted under uncertainty, how you might have chased clarity, reassurance, or emotional resolution. Now, those impulses are gone. You're not withdrawn, but you're not leaning forward either. Your presence feels self-contained, and that difference changes how she perceives you. What makes this especially magnetic is that it wasn't done for her. Growth that's motivated by validation still carries attachment. Growth that happens privately carries independence. And independence alters emotional hierarchy. She no longer feels like the axis your behavior turns around. Stoic discipline shows itself in restraint, in pacing, in choosing not to act when action is unnecessary. That discipline communicates more than improvement ever could. It says your life has structure beyond reaction, that you are governed internally rather than pulled externally. She doesn't need proof. She doesn't need updates. The absence of emotional volatility is proof enough. When she senses that your calm isn't conditional, when it remains, whether she engages or not, it signals something rare: stability without demand. This is why unannounced growth carries weight. It isn't trying to convince. It isn't trying to win. It simply exists. And existence without explanation invites attention. It makes her reassess who you are now, not through memory, but through present reality. Growth doesn't ask to be seen. It allows itself to be noticed, and when it is, it feels authentic. grounded, and far more magnetic than any version of change that needs to be declared. Number 10. Past conflicts lose their charge. One of the clearest signs that something has shifted internally is how the past begins to feel. Old arguments no longer surface with emotional heat. The moments that once carried tension, blame, or defensiveness now feel distant, almost neutral. She doesn't bring them up to justify herself. She doesn't revisit them to reopen wounds or assert position. In many cases, she doesn't mention them at all. And that absence speaks loudly. This isn't avoidance, it's acceptance. Emotional charge no longer protect itself. Earlier, conflict may have served a purpose. It created structure, justified distance. It gave meaning to separation. As long as resentment remained active, the emotional door stayed closed by default. But resentment requires energy to maintain, and over time, that energy drains. Stoicism has always emphasized this truth. Explanation does not dissolve resentment, restraint does. Time alone isn't enough. Time paired with emotional non-interference is what allows old narratives to lose their grip. When you didn't argue your version of events, didn't defend yourself, didn't demand understanding, you removed the fuel that kept conflict alive. Without opposition, the mind eventually re-examines its own conclusions. Not out of obligation, but out of quiet reassessment. When she looks back now, the emotional charge simply isn't there. The intensity that once justified separation feels disproportionate, and without intensity, the conflict loses relevance. Notice how different this is from reconciliation through debate. There are no apologies demanded, no points scored, no emotional scorekeeping. The past isn't being rewritten, it's being set down. That's an important distinction. Stoic acceptance isn't about forgetting or minimizing what happened. It's about no longer allowing it to dictate the present. When past conflicts lose their charge, it means she no longer needs them as emotional armor. They're no longer tools for distance or defense. And once the past stops being weaponized, space opens for something new to form. This doesn't mean everything is resolved. It means the emotional barriers have softened. The mind is no longer anchored to old grievances. And in that neutrality, the future becomes possible again, not because everything was fixed, but because nothing needs to be fought anymore. Stoicism teaches that peace isn't created through winning arguments, but through refusing to keep them alive. And when restraint replaces resistance, the past naturally loosens its hold. What remains is clarity. And clarity is what allows forward movement to be considered quietly, without force. As you sit with this, notice how different true acceptance feels from forced closure. There's no dramatic moment, no announcement, just a quiet shift where the past stops pulling emotional weight. Take a second to reflect on that in your own life, where old stories may have lost their grip, not because they were resolved, but because they were no longer fed. If this resonates, pause the video for a moment and let that realization land. And if you're willing, leave a comment sharing what stood out to you, or simply type, "The past no longer leads me." Let's see what fascinating insights are waiting for us. Number 11. Reaching out feels heavy for her. This is the final and most revealing sign. When she considers reaching out now, it no longer feels easy. It doesn't feel casual. It doesn't feel automatic. Every possible message carries weight. Not because you became distant or cold, but because silence restored consequence. And consequence changes how action feels. In the past, contact may have felt light, effortless. A message could be sent without much thought because the emotional outcome felt predictable. She knew what response would come. She knew it didn't require courage, it required convenience. But that certainty is gone now. And without certainty, vulnerability becomes real. When she thinks about messaging you now, she has to consider risk. What if you don't respond the same way? What if the old dynamic doesn't return? What if reaching out reveals more than she's ready to expose? They create emotional gravity, and gravity makes even simple actions feel significant. Stoic philosophy has always understood this distinction. The Stoics believed meaningful action should never be casual. When something truly matters, it demands intention. It asks for presence. It requires acceptance of outcome. Your silence did exactly that. It removed emotional shortcuts. It restored weight to choice. You didn't make contact difficult by withholding or manipulating. You made it meaningful by not chasing, by not restoring comfort on demand, by not lowering this to your attention. And because of that, any movement toward you, vulnerability. This is not fear, it's respect. Respect hesitates. Respect considers consequence. When really, it's because she understands that her action would matter again. It wouldn't be ignored. It wouldn't be neutral. It would mean something. From a Stoic perspective, this is the quiet restoration of value. You didn't argue your worth. You didn't demand recognition. You allowed time and restraint to speak, and they spoke clearly. Silence restored gravity. Gravity restored intention. And intention is the gateway to genuine connection. If she reaches out now, it won't be because she's bored or curious. It will be because she's ready to step into vulnerability, knowing it carries consequence. And that is the clearest sign of all. You matter again, not because you tried to be felt, but because you allowed absence to reveal weight. Becomes heavy. It means meaning has returned. And once meaning returns, everything changes. What all of this points to is a simple truth. When someone truly comes back, it isn't driven by impulse or emotional noise. It's driven by weight, by the quiet realization that something meaningful was lost, and that reaching toward it now carries consequence. Nothing you saw today was loud or dramatic, and that's exactly why it matters. These signs only appear when you stop chasing outcomes and start standing firmly in yourself. When silence isn't used as a tactic, but as a reflection of inner steadiness, that's when value re-emerges. Not because you demanded it, but because you allowed space for it to be felt. If this resonated with you, take a moment to like the video so more people can find it. Leave a comment and share which sign stood out to you the most, or what you've noticed shift when you chose calm over reaction. And if you're ready to go deeper, watch the recommended videos on screen now. They build directly on this idea and show what happens next when silence, restraint, and stoic presence continue to do their work. She thought the moment that mattered would be loud an argument, a goodbye, a final message. But the real shift happened in the quiet, when you didn't do what she was waiting for. You didn't react. You didn't reach. You didn't try to hold the story together. And in that stillness, something subtle but powerful began to change. In this video, we're going to break down the silent shift that unsettled her, not because of anything you said, but because of what you refused to do. You'll see how Stoic presence isn't about withdrawal or ego, but about standing so firmly in your own value that your absence carries more weight than words ever could. If this speaks to where you are right now, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's begin. Number 1. She thought she knew you. For a long time, she felt certain about you, not because she truly understood your inner world, but because your behavior followed a rhythm she had grown comfortable with. When something felt off, you reacted. When distance appeared, you reached out. When tension surfaced, you clarified. Over time, these responses created a pattern, and patterns create the illusion of understanding. She didn't need to read you deeply, she only needed to anticipate you. That anticipation gave her a sense of control, even if she never consciously framed it that way. This is where predictability quietly becomes a weakness. Not because consistency is wrong, but because emotional transparency, without restraint, teaches others how to move you. In Stoic thinking, especially in the writings of Epictetus, freedom begins where reactivity ends. A man who reveals every internal shift, every emotional response, slowly hands over leverage, not through words, but through reliability. When others know exactly how you will respond, they stop respecting the boundary between what belongs to you and what belongs to them. What unsettled her wasn't your silence itself. It was what the silence disrupted. You didn't announce a change. You didn't explain yourself. You didn't draw a line in the sand or issue a declaration of independence. You simply stopped confirming the version of you she thought she knew. No reassurance, no emotional punctuation, just absence where reaction used to be. And that absence broke the script. The human mind relies heavily on predictability to feel safe. When that predictability disappears, confidence erodes quietly at first. She may tell herself you're busy, distracted, processing, but beneath those rationalizations, something deeper shifts. The certainty she once felt that she knew where she stood with you starts to wobble, not dramatically, subtly. And subtle doubt is often more unsettling than overt loss. From a Stoic perspective, this is not about withholding or playing games. It's about reclaiming self-command. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a man's strength is measured by how little he needs external confirmation to remain steady. When you stopped reacting on cue, you didn't become cold, you became self-contained. And self-containment changes how others perceive you. She thought she knew you because you were readable. Now, without drama or explanation, that readability is gone. And in its place, uncertainty enters. Not because you did something to her, but because you stopped giving away access to your inner movements. That is the first crack. Number 2. Your silence felt different. At first, she tried to label it the same way she had labeled silence before. Distance, withdrawal, maybe even indifference. But something didn't quite fit. This silence didn't carry the sharpness of resentment, nor the emptiness of emotional exhaustion. It wasn't cold, and it wasn't passive. There was no bitterness leaking through it, no performative absence meant to provoke a reaction. Instead, it felt grounded. And that difference is what made it unsettling. Most silence people encounter is reactive. It's a pause filled with unspoken emotion, a waiting room for confrontation, explanation, or eventual release. This wasn't that. Your silence didn't feel like something you were enduring. It felt like something you had chosen. And choice changes the emotional weight of everything. When silence is chosen, it stops being a gap and becomes a presence. The Stoics spoke often about restraint, but not as suppression. Restraint, to them, was strength held back by judgment. Musonius Rufus described self-control as the ability to act or not act with equal clarity, like a warrior lowering his weapon not because the fight is lost, but because he no longer needs to prove his ability to strike. That kind of restraint carries gravity. It signals command over impulse. That is the energy your silence carried. You weren't punishing. You weren't retreating. You weren't waiting to be noticed. You simply stopped participating in a dynamic that required constant emotional output from you. And because there was no visible struggle in that decision, it felt heavier than any argument ever could. Noise can be dismissed. Discipline cannot. This is why the silence lingered in her awareness.